community, and it's also time for the Secretary of State to speak up for the farming community and not simply do as the Treasury asks.
Steve Barclay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. So we've got...
Somebody getting.
Yeah, do we say when? And I need to find them.
Okay, all right, let's do this.
Every day. When they die, this policy will then make farm unviable. They won't sell off land to pay for that tax.
James Evans, you were Conservative MP for Brecon
No, I'm the current Senate member for Brecon and Radnor.
Oh my God, yes it is. Oh my God, yes. He's come with you. All the time. No. I'm so sorry.
sacked me. You sacked me.
Forgive me. Forgive me. Oh, Westminster
No.
bit. I'm so sorry.
I got started. Look.
Let's try that again. Okay. I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Oh, God. I think my brain has frozen along with my toes and my
okay.
fingers. Okay. James Evans, you are a member of the Senedd for Brecon and Radnorshire in Wales. Tell us how this is going down in Wales, and also Welsh farmers have got some specific problems, haven't they?
Well, Welsh farmers have got huge problems. The removal of agriculture inheritance relief now is putting added pressure on top of the sustainable farming scheme, which has been announced by the Welsh Labour government, which wants to plant 10% of farmland in trees and 10% in biodiversity gain. You know, that's 20% of someone's farm being taken away, on top of now what the Labour government in Westminster is doing to them. And you've got the First Minister in Wales telling farmers they need to calm down. You know, it's very disrespectful to our farming communities. They're the people who produce food, put that food on our tables and keep us fed. And I'm afraid to say Labour just don't understand the rural communities, and they don't understand our farmers either.
You've had obviously a Welsh government in Wales for many, many, many years. Surely the Welsh government at least should understand Welsh farmers. What's gone wrong?
Well, the Welsh Labour government has been in power for 25 years now, and they've always attacked the rural communities. They just don't get farming. You know, every scheme they brought out has been very much not liked by the farming community across Wales. But it's just a shame, and hopefully at the next Senedd elections we can remove Labour, because what they're doing to them here now in Westminster, what they've done to them to 25 years in Cardiff, it's just time for a change. We need to get rid of Labour both here and in Cardiff Bay.
But there is a problem, isn't there, with people buying up land as a way to get round inheritance tax. That is something that does need to be addressed. Is the government not right in trying to deal with that?
So it needs to be looked at around that, however, but a lot of this changes are going to affect the small family farms, those people who are producing food, who want to pass their farms on to the next generation. Those are the people who this is going to affect more so, because there's big corporations who are buying up farms for greenwashing are going to do that anyway. We're seeing that in Wales and certain parts of my own constituency, where prime productive farmland is being bought to plant in trees for big companies who think they can then greenwash the countryside just to make themselves feel good. That's not what I want to see. I want to see our family farms supported and thriving for now and generations into the future.
James Evans, thanks very much for talking to us. Thank you. Yeah. So 96, so that will make, how worried are you about reform though?
Quite big. Yeah. They're a challenge at the minute, but you never know.
Yeah.
We're doing all we can to try and challenge that and make them non-existent.
hours and not waiting for them to do it.
Thank you very much indeed.
Love you.
Thank you very much. Oh my God. James Evans. And it's the most Welsh name ever as well.
Sorry.
You look very familiar. Who met before?
Maybe I've worked at Jubilees. So,
Oh,
yeah, but I've worked for Red Smith.
not hold on 1 second. We're not at Milk for the simple reason that those are all for the calls, so we're
Oh,
all
fine.
covered. And I've got a live edition.
Oh, okay, yes, okay.
But
He's going there at 9 anyway.
I've seen you. Who's going tonight?
Greg is doing the panel at Valuation.
Oh,
He's
excellent.
going to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
no
you.
worries.
Nice
Thank
to
you.
see you.
You
Bye-bye.
too. See you.
Right, has all that gone back? They've got all that. Okay, and they can float pictures of, and I'll just talk about them being here and whatever.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh, God, it's horrible, isn't it? Oh, I'm going to take my hat off. I might actually wrap this around my neck as well because it's bloody freezing. Can I just move this to slightly higher ground because I basically stood in a puddle there. Can I just stand here?
Of European countries, and now, as you say, we have 12 other countries supporting us from as far away as New Zealand, quite a lot of European nations, and it makes for a very rich environment that we can draw from each other's skill sets to train the Ukrainians.
Okay, Colonel.
Do you feel like many farmers feel and agree with what the government minister just said there, that the government's commitment to farming is absolute?
No, this government doesn't back farming in Westminster. You can see that by the number of farmers that have turned up here today in Westminster to protest against these changes. The government say this is only going to affect a small number of farms. That's absolute lunacy. You've only got to look how much farms are selling for currently, and I'm afraid to say this government, yet again, doesn't back farmers, it doesn't back rural Britain, and the Labour Party just doesn't understand our rural communities across Britain.
But what is the argument in terms of whether or not people, even if it is quite a lot of them, if it's over £1 million, it's quite a lot of money. Should they pay some level of inheritance tax?
I think what people are doing, they're missing the point here. A lot of farmers want to pass their farm to the next generation. Our farmers are proud to produce the food that goes on our plates, that keeps us all hungry, that keeps us all fed. And I'm afraid to say that many farmers are going to have to sell up and sell their farms under these proposals. Farmers do not want to do that. They want to keep producing the highest quality food produced anywhere across the world. And that is why farmers have come here today to protest against this. I'm afraid to say if Labour want to see the end of our countryside, they're going a great way about doing that. But farmers here today are not going to have that. They're going to fight tooth and nail for what we believe in. I'm a farmer myself, and I want us to keep farming for generations to come, to pass it on to the younger farmers. And there's plenty of young people here today who want to be farming in the future, and that's why people are here today, to support our next generation of farmers.
And forgive me for if I missed the point on this, but what is the argument against a farmer selling his farm to a younger farmer as opposed to passing it on to his own children?
Well, I'm afraid to say if anybody who thinks that young people can get into the industry at the minute, it's very difficult. You know, land prices are exceptionally high because numerous governments, the Labour government in Cardiff and the Labour government here in Westminster, are doing nothing to incentivise the next generation of farmers to come into the industry. Farmers want to farm, they want to produce food, and the young farmer who's actually just behind the camera here looks very keen to want to be farming in the future. Let's have a look at your poster. They are. Support family farms. We need to secure the future for farms across Wales. And young men like this are the reason why all the farms have come here. They've come here to support our farmers so this young man can keep farming for future generations to come.
I appreciate that, James, but obviously we're interviewing you in your role as Shadow Minister at the moment. We're covering the protests and speaking to the protesters separately, and we don't need to do that in the middle of the interview, if that's all right. Talk to me about the fact that so many farmers are saying this will affect them. Why is there a discrepancy in the numbers then compared to what the government is suggesting?
Well, the discrepancy of the numbers is a discrepancy between what DEFRA are saying, actually the Treasury, and this just shows that the Labour government brought this in without no planning at all. I'm afraid to say they said this will only affect 500 farms. That's absolute madness. You've only got to look on look on Savills, look on Rightmove, how much farms are selling for at the moment. This is going to affect farms right away across the country.
Please, everyone on the pavement on the left-hand side, please keep moving down so everyone else can see.
This is going to affect farms.
Everyone on the pavement down the left-hand side from the stage, please keep moving down.
Going to affect those 500.
Don't shuffle, let's get a bit tighter. Move on down.
Should have done the proper assessment.
Okay.
We should have done a proper impact assessment of how this was going to affect our farmers across the country.
James, thanks so much for that. We appreciate you joining us. James Evans, the Shadow Minister of Farming in Wales, losing a little bit of the sound there towards the end. We're going to take a very quick break here on Sky News today. We'll have the latest from those protests in Westminster when we come back.
It's like a football final with only one team on the pitch. This isn't just a call to vote, but a call to remember. The freedom fought for by the African National Congress.
I'm Yusra Al-Bagher, Sky's Africa correspondent based in Johannesburg, South Africa.
A cyclone and 2 burst dams wiped out hundreds of generational homes.
This was the second dam that the floodwaters hit before it tore into Derna.
We are in the heart of Nairobi, and we're watching as protesters were heavily tear gassed.
The sheer fearlessness and persistence of these guys is astonishing.
We help you understand the world with us. I remember going into the iconic Durman market in the heart of Sudan's capital for the first time since the war started.
And this is what's left of it. Bullet holes through buildings, shelled balconies, bullet cases on the floor.
I witnessed the complete destruction of a place linked to my childhood memories and the lives of millions of people.
This is insane. This was a bustling residential area. So many friends who lived here.
My most memorable interview was with a 15-year-old boy who'd survived being stranded on a migrant boat on its way from Senegal to the Canary Islands.
After 13 days, our food, water and fuel supply ran out.
I felt awe when we saw the mountain gorillas in Rwanda.
They call him the king of the jungle. This is the alpha silverback.
Sky News. Get the full story first. Yusra Al-Bagher, Sky News.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Well, our correspondent Dan Whitehead is with farmers in Westminster for us now, as of course we're awaiting some of the main speeches due from this event and gathering. Let's get over to Dan for a pulse check on the latest there.
Yeah, well, several thousand farmers have all arrived now on Whitehall, opposite Downing Street. You can see behind me here, this is part of the food bank which the organisers have been getting together here. Just lots of donations. The farmers from across the country have been bringing their produce down here, as well as other goods, leaving that to be donated to a food bank. Let's just have a little walk through here. And see if we can have a chat to them. About 10 minutes until the speakers start. As I say, we're expecting Jeremy Clarkson, Tory leader Kemi Badenoch to speak as well. Excuse me, guys, can we have a quick chat with you guys? We're on Sky News about why you wanted to come down here today. Why did you feel it was important to come and support?
Well, I'm a dairy farmer, first generation. Got 2 sons in the business. If this tax comes into place, I built this farm up over the last 30 years. My sons will have to pay £625,000 just to stay on the farm.
Wow. And where is your farm? Sorry, sir.
My farm is in Staplehurst in Kent.
What is your reaction to the government? They say they are staying steadfast and they are not going to back down.
Today's peaceful. That's all I say. Today is the peaceful day. What comes in the future?
Understand. OK, thank you so much for speaking to us. Let's just have a little look down the road here, because we're hearing some charges, some cheering. You can see the tractors now coming through. Let's just take a listen. So some of the tractors coming through central London now. 10 minutes or so until the speeches start. The farmers will then march down Whitehall and around Parliament Square after the speeches finish. Difficult, of course, to get a gauge exactly on the numbers, but there are certainly several thousand farmers at least who have come down here today, angry at these government changes, introducing inheritance tax of 20% on farms over £1 million. And many farmers disagree with what the government say that this will not only affect the very wealthiest 500 estates, it will also affect many smaller farms who fear they will have to sell that land in order to pay that bill. Let's have a little walk around here. Lots of cheers. There's a nice atmosphere here. Excuse me, sir. Live on Sky News, can you just tell us why you wanted to come down here and support the protest?
Well, just to show that it's made, well, it's knocked the stuffing out of us, basically. It's taken all of our confidence out of our business, our planning, everything. We just want to tell the government that this isn't the way forward.
If the government say they're staying steadfast, that they're going to push through this proposal, what happens then?
We'll just keep going. We'll just keep going. We'll keep coming back, because this can't go ahead. This just can't go ahead.
Thank you very much. That is the word. Here I think we've got someone coming down here. That may well be Jeremy Clarkson. Let's just head down there. Let's just head down because we want to see if we can have a chat with Mr. Clarkson. If that is him, it is him. Let's just get in there. Jeremy, Sky News, what do you... Jeremy, what's your word to the government?
Who would you replace him?
Jeremy, what's your word to the government? You're live on Sky.
Please back down. Please back down.
Just to your left, please. Please back down. The word there from Jeremy Clarkson. You can just see, of course, how much he has meant to the farmers. An absolute bun fight. As he comes to the back of the stage here. Jeremy Clarkson, of course, the TV presenter, but his hugely successful series, Clarkson's Farm, and he has really done a lot for the farming industry. A lot of farmers saying that Jeremy's done more for farming than anyone, really, in terms of the NFU and getting that message across and the struggles that farmers are going through. Just trying to... And he's just being pushed through there now.
Pushing through it. The difference between pushing and pushing.
Where's the homeless? And we heard there from Jeremy, just back down. That was his message to the government here. And that is not what Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has said they will do. It is not what the Environment Secretary, Steve Reed, has said he will do. They will stay with those plans and will not back down. That is the word that we've had.
Strike. No. I think there's a lot more impactful things. I think farmers can do better than that. I've got some ideas.
Keep moving back, please.
Sorry, guys.
To be, Jeremy, for farmers.
Keep moving,
sorry.
Keep moving, please, guys. Sorry, of course we are. Sorry, guys, can we keep moving?
How bad could this be for farmers, Jeremy?
It's the end.
In a hard right, Kenny?
If you actually stop and pay attention, it's the end.
Hard right, hard right. Thank you.
Back, guys. Watch those bollards as you go back.
Pollard behind you, mate.
What's your bollards? What's your bollards?
Do you regret getting into farming? Now you see how difficult it is. Keep down the right and take it.
Just move to my left. Move to my left. Thank you.
Pollard behind you.
Thank you.
Move to the left, please.
Past the stage, first right.
Guys, which sills?
To the left.
Jeremy.
Thanks, everyone. Best of luck.
Watch your backs, guys.
Make some noise.
Straight across the street.
Watch your backs, guys. You want to cross the road?
Go on, Clarkson. Watch your backs, guys. Watch your backs.
Watch your backs, guys. Watch your backs. I'll bet that.
Yeah, no, I've seen on the map already.
Jeremy. Good job, guys. I just wanted to just stop for a moment. Is that okay? And then fine.
Keep on moving, guys. You're supposed to be here.
No. Decided I prefer badges and boxes in this lot.
Sorry?
I said decided I prefer badges and boxes.
That's how to win.
Influence people. Well done, Clarkson.
Hi there. Gav, cross the road here.
Cross the road. Hold it this way, Jeremy.
Cheers. Sorry, there you go. Guys, come on, you've got the shots now. These are never going to work. You know that. There's nothing in the background. Guys, honestly. Jesus. It's a good job I've been through this before. Right. Training when you get
Jeremy. Come on, mate. Come on, Jeremy. Come on.
Good training when you get sacked.
Yes, I'm not sure I'm allowed in technically.
Come on.
Right, sorry, Claire. So you've just got it's up to the
I don't know if Dan Whitehead is still there for us to sum up some of the sentiments there, some of which we heard, some of which we didn't hear from Jeremy Clarkson. I think let's assume he's not there, but we might come back to Dan for a summary of some of that. I mean, one of the key questions, of course, that was put to Jeremy Clarkson there was, what does this mean for farming? And he said it's the end. So a hint there of the severity with which Jeremy Clarkson is interpreting these latest rules towards farming from the government. Of course, we also heard earlier from the Environment Minister, Steve Reed, giving the opposite side of the argument. And let's listen to that now.
We inherited a £22 billion black hole from the previous government, and the previous Chancellor of the Exchequer covered the scale of that problem up. So none of us knew how difficult the problem would be when we were coming into government. But this government's commitment to farming and to farmers is absolute. That's why we've allocated £5 billion to farming in the budget. That's the biggest amount of money in our country's history for sustainable food production. But we have to plug that £22 billion black hole in our public finances. Otherwise, we can't fix our public services like the broken National Health Service. So it's only right that we've had to ask the wealthiest landowners and the biggest farms to pay their fair share. But I would emphasise only around 500 farms will be affected. The vast majority of farmers will pay no more under the new scheme than they do under the current one.
Well, Dan Whitehead, as you know, has been at the protests for us and covering this story for quite some time. Here is his overarching report.
Come on, then. Come on.
Cattle here have been looked after by Will's family since 1939.
Come on.
One day he hopes to hand the 500-acre farm in South Gloucestershire down to his son. But the government's new inheritance tax plans could make that difficult.
We've probably buried our head in the sand a little bit about it. I think, back of a fag packet, rough estimates, tax is going to be north of £500,000.
Will would get 10 years to pay that bill.
Let's say that's £50,000 a year. You got that spare?
It's more than our profit in any year that we've had in the last 10 years. Dad's saying we're going to have to sell something. It's worrying. It's worrying. It's an additional worry that we didn't need.
Will is one of thousands of farmers descending on London today, angry at the government's proposal to charge 20% inheritance tax on farms over £1 million.
For farmers like Will and thousands of others, this isn't just about a huge new tax bill. Many see it as yet another stumbling block to getting the next generation of farmers to take over in an industry that already feels like it's under attack.
This isn't the first protest farmers have held this year. Hundreds rolled into Westminster back in March, angry at cheap imports. Today, the National Farmers Union will gather 1,800 members to lobby MPs. But such is the level of frustration, many more are expected to protest on the streets.
We in the NFU, we have a detailed job to do, which is to explain to government why this is wrong, not just for farming, not just for the countryside, but not just for our families, but for the economy in general. This is a bad tax and it's been badly implemented because it will affect growth and productivity in the country.
The government says only the wealthiest of estates will be impacted, with 72% of farms unaffected, a calculation the union says is wrong.
And so fourth generation, wow.
Yeah, I know. I signed up to it in blood.
It's why farmers like Will are leaving the countryside for the city to demand the government thinks again. Dan Whitehead, Sky News, in South Gloucestershire.
Yeah.
Let's just remind you of some of the key facts relating to all of this. Farming land has been exempt from inheritance tax since the 1980s, but from 2026 have to pay 20% on land worth more than £1 million. That's half the usual inheritance tax rate of 40%, with a higher initial threshold as well. The government say just a quarter of farms will be impacted by the changes, but the National Farmers Union say that based on the Department for the Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs' own figures, almost half of farms in England are worth more than £1.5 million. So all those and more would be affected. And the union says that many farmers can't afford those bills given average annual earnings are less than £50,000. Well, the head of the National Farmers Union has told Sky News his members feel betrayed after the government said last year they wouldn't change the tax rules.
They simply have to move on this. The policy they've designed is very, very poorly thought through. The foundations of the numbers behind it are questionable, even DEFRA and the Treasury can't agree on them. And then when we look at the human impact of this policy, they've designed a policy which has got the elderly generation in the twilight of their careers absolutely in the centre of this policy with no way to plan for it. They've given everything to this country to produce the food the country needs, and they can't plan their way through it. That is simply unacceptable.
Well, the Shadow Environment Secretary also responded, and this is what she had to say.
Well, farmers across the United Kingdom are feeling betrayed because the DEFRA Secretary, City Steve, as I call him, has promised before the election that they would not touch this inheritance tax. In fact, he called, when we warned people that they may be looking at this, he called it desperate nonsense. And yet, come this budget of broken promises, this is one of the promises they have broken to the electorate.
The protests in Westminster and bring in Sky's Dan Whitehead. Dan, what's the mood there? Of course, you're chasing Jeremy Clarkson down the street there for a moment as well.
Yeah, back down now was the words from Jeremy Clarkson towards the government. He was absolutely mobbed. I got separated from my cameraman there, but the speeches are about to start, and you can see, I mean, we'll try and get a slightly higher shot, but there are thousands here. The tractors are parked up. Whitehall really has come to a standstill. The police wanted to keep both sides of traffic open. I think that's failed now, and the whole of Whitehall has ground to a halt as thousands of farmers have come from all over the United Kingdom. We know they've come from Northern Ireland, from Wales, from Scotland and across England. They are angry at what the government is doing with inheritance tax, and they say that this is not only going to affect the wealthiest farms, and not just less than 500, as Rachel Reeves and the Environment Secretary says, that it will be many thousands more. That's what farmers say. And they also say that this is more than just about a big inheritance tax bill. It is about food security. It is about the makeup of our countryside. Let's see if we can find some of the farmers to chat through. I think it was Zoe and Steve, was it? Yeah, OK. On the phone now. But look, you've all come down here with your banners here. Zoe, whereabouts is your farm? Tell us a little bit about your farm.
We're on a cattle farm in East Sussex. We've been there for about 2 years, but we were on a sheep farm previously. So farming's always been in our family.
How much of an impact will this inheritance tax change have for you and your farm?
It won't actually impact. We don't own the farm, but we know families that own farms, and yeah, we're just here to support, really.
And this is a real concern for thousands of farmers who've come down here, who are worried how they're going to afford this. In the farming that you've spoken to, we're hearing about people potentially having to sell their land.
Yeah, I think it's awful. I think that's people's livelihoods, and they have children that they can pass on the farms to, and I think, yeah, it's just really sad. It's a whole lifestyle being changed.
How long's the farm been in your family?
Stephen's dad's farm. They've been there all his life.
Yeah, I was born on the farm. My dad was a tenant farmer. He recently passed away, so we've taken on a farm ourselves, which I basically produce organic grass-fed beef. But obviously, price is a problem, but also the next problem is the next generation. There's going to be no farms left where the generations will just peter out because they don't have the money to buy themselves back into the farm.
Their own. There's an argument about food security here as well, isn't there?
Yeah, we agree with that. Like I say, we produce beef, which is a slightly higher price. We can't compete with imports that are much cheaper and a lower standard.
But It's the way it's going, isn't it? You can go into supermarkets where the fresh chicken is from Poland. We went into a supermarket a couple of months ago. You can get chicken from Brazil for £1. People, of course, are voting with their wallets. Is there a risk that buying British becomes a sort of a luxury choice?
It gets like that, but it should be reversed and, you know, go back 20, 30 years where everyone wanted to buy British and, you know, British was best, let's say. Yeah, so, and also, you know, so much when something happens, I don't know, a war or something like that, and we can't get the income, not the income, you know, the direct sales coming from other countries, we should be producing ourselves. And if all the land gets sold or not in use, then what? There'll be no cereal, no meat, everything will have to be imported, and then we're the begging, we're at their, let's say, yes, you know, we don't have no say.
Some people will say that lots of companies, lots of people have to pay inheritance tax. Why shouldn't farmers pay?
Most of the time, because none of these farmers actually make huge amounts of money to put money away year after year after year to pay these things. It's just, you know, farming's been around a lot longer than big companies that are making, you know, plastics, let's say.
The government said this morning it's not backing down. It's not going to change. No. Farmers got to do their bit. What's next after this protest if they don't back down?
I would imagine if they don't back down, I would probably say we try and do a bit more like the French do.
We've lost the connection there. We're obviously seen the inclement weather that farmers are no doubt used to, but maybe our technology not quite used to it sufficiently. But we'll get back to Dan in a moment. As you saw moments ago, he was pursuing Jeremy Clarkson moments ago. So let's just have a little listen back to what Jeremy Clarkson had to say.
This is where the food comes from. And if the government ends farming, which is seemingly what it wants to do, where do we get our food from?
If they go on strike, then what?
I don't think farmers will go on strike.
No.
I think there's a lot more impactful things. I think farmers can do better than that. I've got some ideas.
Keep moving back, please, fella. How to be, Jeremy, for farmers?
Keep moving, please, guys. Sorry, of course we are. Sorry, guys, can we keep moving?
How bad could this be for farmers, Jeremy?
It's the end.
Then a hard right, Kenny.
If you actually stop and pay attention, it's the end.
Hard right, hard right.
Jeremy Clarkson, I think also saying there that farmers, his advice wouldn't be to go on strike if they don't get what they want, but it was quite hard to tell exactly what the gist of what he was saying there was. But equally, at another moment in that pursuit of Clarkson, he was asked what would happen to farming if these rules were continuing to go in place, and he said it would be the end. Of course, we've heard the counter-argument from the Environment Secretary, Steve Reed, as well. We're going to get more from those protests in Westminster with Dan Whitehead throughout the day, and we will go back live as and when the key speeches, including from Clarkson, do take place. The Tory leader, the Conservative Party leader, Kemi Badenoch, expected to be there as well. But for now, to the war in Eastern Europe, and today marks 1,000 days since Russia invaded Ukraine. The conflict appears to be entering a new phase, with US President Biden giving Ukraine permission to use long-range missiles against targets in Russia. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has posted on X saying, "Today is the sobering milestone of 1,000 days since Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. As the people of Ukraine continue to bravely defend their sovereignty, the UK's commitment to them remains ironclad." Our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, is in Kiev and has the latest for us.
The first explosions we saw happened about 30 minutes into the start of this day, and I think that says as much as you need to know about where this is going. However, it is going to be marked. I mean, there's small memorial services taking place right now, and there'll be more later in the day. The President's going to address the nation. He's also speaking to the European Parliament as well. So I think it is considered a significant day, but, you know, it's going to be 1,000 days and one tomorrow, and the war will go on. What happens next? Of course, I think we're into a sort of critical phase in this, because obviously it's the end of the Biden administration and the Trump administration will take over. We don't know what he is going to do, what attitude he's going to take. And of course, we now have the long-range weapons coming into play. albeit limited in areas, the Kursk area, where they can be used. Ukraine is going to try to up the pressure on President Biden and probably France and Britain to be allowed to use those long-range weapons at targets of their choosing, not just one area. But all of that's got to be discussed. As I say, it is a significant day, but it is just one more day and the war carries on tomorrow.
Stuart, are we expecting the missiles, the ATACMS, to be used a lot and often and soon?
I think the problem is just how many they've got, and we don't know how many they have. The expectation it will be quite soon, but they have had them for a while. They've just had to use them within Ukraine's territory, even the areas taken over by Russia. We believe that they will use them in that Kursk area, but we just don't know how many they've got left because they weren't given many in the first place. I think what will be interesting going forward to see, well, particularly if President Trump allows them to continue to use them, whether there will be an increased supply. But there aren't that many in production already, so it'll be interesting to see whether that is the case and whether they've either stockpiled enough or whether they will get more as we go forward.
Well, let's talk more about the latest situation in Ukraine and bring in now Professor Michael Clark, who's with me here on set. Michael, good to see you. Let's start with a snapshot of where we are on this 1000th day. What's your assessment?
Yeah, well, here we are, getting on for 3 years into the war. This was Putin's 3-day war, of course. And he's doubled down on it and redoubled down on it. And Putin's indicated that he's prepared to do whatever it takes. So regardless of the losses, 750,000 now, Russian losses. The economy has been bent out of shape for this war, even though that's not always a bad thing for him, but it's being bent out of shape. And he'll do whatever it takes. It's a war of attrition. And it isn't clear whether the West is really prepared for a war of attrition. Because ultimately, Russia is so much bigger than Ukraine. Its population is 3 times bigger. It's 10 times bigger in terms of area. It's not so much richer, but ultimately, if the war goes on for a long time, a big power will normally prevail over a smaller power. Unless that smaller power has got the backing of the West, which is, even without the United States, Western Europe is 10 times richer than Russia. With the United States, it's about 20 times richer than Russia. However, we don't seem to want to pursue this without too much economic disruption to ourselves. So Putin has created a war of attrition, which he thinks now that he's in a position to win.
Clearly, Sunday night started to cross these headlines that the US has given permissions for the ATACMS missiles to be used into Russian territory. Is that less of a headline than it initially appeared on Sunday evening?
It probably is, because now we're aware of the restrictions. So the ATACMS missiles, which have got a range of almost 200 miles, but they can only be used in the Kursk area. And this is really America's attempt to allow or help the Ukrainians to hold on to Kursk for longer, and also to counter the idea that 10,000 North Koreans are now fighting in Kursk on behalf of the Russians. I think the Ukrainians would really like to, as it were, to hurt the North Koreans. They'd like the North Korean mission to fail so that it doesn't become the precursor to a much bigger North Korean involvement. If the 10,000 North Koreans look as if they're doing a useful job for the Russians, more will follow. And although 10,000 there are 400,000 Russians fighting in Ukraine, 10,000 Koreans doesn't make a whole lot of difference. But if they sent 100,000, it would start to make a difference. So it matters, I think, to the Ukrainians that they show North Korea that if they send their troops to Kursk, or even worse, to Ukraine, they will die. That's what the message they want to send.
Why hasn't UK permission, or joint UK-US permission for the Storm Shadows been given yet, and what difference would it make if it was?
Yeah, we keep going around in circles about this. I mean, one view is that they could be used, but they'd be used without American help in targeting. Another version, and the government is a bit ambiguous about this, in fact very ambiguous, is that some of the components in Storm Shadow are American, and therefore you need American permission to use them. And they seem to hop from one version to another, and the sense that we want to stay in line with our allies. Well, if we can stay in line with our allies, if ATACMS can now be used, well, why not Storm Shadow? And I think it's no secret that the present government has been trying to persuade the Americans to, as it were, take all the limitations off and let Storm Shadow be used in whatever way the Ukrainians think they should use them. The issue for Storm Shadow is it is the permissions, but it's also the numbers. I mean, we had a stock, it was believed, of about 1,000. We've probably given 200 or 300 of them to Ukraine already, and we've probably got, let's guess, 600 perhaps. How many of those must we keep for ourselves? Well, probably all of them, really, but how many could they afford to give? Maybe another couple of hundred? That will help, but it won't turn the tide.
How long does it take to make a new one?
Years. I mean, tilers who make it are turning out small numbers, I mean, 2 or 3 a month. And they would have to up their production hugely. And so you've got to go on a trawl around the world for Storm Shadow and Scalp, the French version. You've got to go on a trawl around the world for the sort of cruise missiles that can do the same sort of thing. On old production schedules, we don't even begin to build up our stocks for several years. We've got to think in emergency terms if we're going to take this seriously.
Michael, it's always a pleasure. Thanks so much, Michael Clark. Lots more still to come after this short break. We'll be getting a snapshot on the scale of the cold weather that's coming.
I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. Donald Trump, it would appear, is about to learn his fate. There's no doubting the strength of this hurricane as it roars through. Sky News, get the full story first. Do you fear a fourth indictment?
He's from Sky News. He's from Sky News. He's entitled to ask me questions.
Trust in politics is at an all-time low. What's going wrong and can we fix it? It's from Liz. She wants to know, why is there still no sign of the Labour Party electing a woman as leader?
It's sort of embarrassing. You know, it takes a very strong man to be leader, but it takes an even stronger man to support a woman for leader.
If you want to be mean to politicians, like, crack on. The activists that go out and make elections happen, I kind of feel like just don't be horrible to them. Be polite to them in the same way that they're polite to you.
Keir Starmer has got us into government with a big majority. He was completely clear before the election that he wasn't going to be able to do the two-child benefit policy, but I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't an early thing that comes along.
I went up to Gordon Brown and said, hello? No, yes, where is it? I said, found all these Tory candidates breaking land. Let me see it, let me see it. This is brilliant, brilliant.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
Snowy conditions have caused school closures, train cancellations and road delays across the UK this morning. Here's a snow-covered balcony and garden in Derby. Parts of Buckinghamshire also saw heavy snowfall overnight. And it was even snowing in parts of North London this morning too. Well, earlier we spoke to senior Met Office presenter Aidan McGivern, who told us more about what to expect from the weather across the UK in the week ahead and where we might see further snowfall.
Forecast is for it to stay cold over the next few days. Increasingly, it will be northern and eastern and western coasts that will see snow showers. Plenty of sunshine inland, but it's going to feel very cold up until the weekend. And then in the weekend, we're going to see Atlantic weather return, so some very wet and windy weather moving in. A transient period of snow across central and northern parts of the UK as that happens on Saturday.
Well, our correspondent Amelia Harper has more on those weather warnings that are in place.
It is the first taste that we are having yet of winter. We are being warned to expect disruptive snow throughout the day for many parts of the UK. There are 3 weather warnings, yellow weather warnings, that we saw on that map you had just a moment ago from the Met Office. They apply to northern Scotland, northern England, parts of Northern Ireland, the Midlands and North East Wales. And this yellow warning for England runs until 11 a.m. and the warning for Scotland will remain in place until 10 a.m. on the Wednesday. And the Met Office has warned that the worst affected areas could see around 20 centimetres of snow. These are areas that might be over 300 metres in elevation, and they haven't specified exact areas because, as you might imagine, it's quite hard to predict exactly where snow is going to fall. But they have mentioned Derbyshire in England as an area that is going to be particularly affected. This is actually Buckinghamshire. Those are pictures from Buckinghamshire at the moment. And of course, in situations like this, people using the road and rail need to take extra care, particularly people in the north of England. National Highways has issued an amber severe snow alert for roads around the northeast and the northwest. And National Rail says that the cold will impact some routes into this afternoon. So obviously we've got some snowy pictures there, but for some there are warnings, of course, as it may be incredibly disruptive. Through the rest of the week, we are expecting to see temperatures that are much colder than we would see normally for mid-November, and at night we are set to see temperatures dipping below freezing.
Amelia Harper there for us. You're watching Sky News. Up next, it's Business Live with Darren McCaffrey. And Darren will have all the very latest as farmers march on Westminster.
A very good morning. These are the top business stories live from the Sky Newsroom. Farmers march on Westminster to protest against the Chancellor's changes to inheritance tax. We'll be in central London as farmers arrive from right across the UK to call on the government to rethink its plans. A very good morning on this Tuesday. Business Live with me, Darren McCaffrey. Only really one story in town today, and that is that thousands of farmers have travelled from across the UK in the biggest protest yet against the government's changes to inheritance tax rules. Farmers say that the changes will lead to land being sold to pay the tax bill and that it will impact food security and the future, the very future, of British farming itself. The government says it is committed to the farming industry and has had to make difficult decisions. So what are the issues at stake? There's a lot of figures being bandied around. Let's speak to our business and economics correspondent, Paul Kelso, who's been looking at the numbers and joins us now. Very good morning to you, Paul. As I said, there's been a lot of contention, confusion, disagreements about the numbers, the NFU claiming one figure, the government disputing that.
Yeah, the farmers are on the streets because Rachel Reeves wants to change inheritance tax rules. Specifically, she wants to make farms, for the first time since the 1980s, subject to inheritance tax. Now, nobody likes inheritance tax. Actually, very few people have to pay it, around 4%. But until now, farmers haven't had to pay at all. And that's because they get full relief, 100% relief, as it's known, under two categories that can apply to a farm. Agricultural property relief, this is the number the government has lent on. That applies to land, to farm buildings, woodland, that kind of thing. But also business property relief. That's your livestock, cereals, the product you make, farm equipment, crucially, and anything you've done to diversify the farm. So cottages that have become holiday lets. They've all been free of inheritance tax entirely. Now, that is going to change, and the Chancellor is going to bundle together those two areas of relief and give much more limited thresholds. £1 million for every farmer. That can rise to £1.5 million because everybody gets about £500,000 of inheritance tax relief. Now, if there's a couple who are married and passing on the farm jointly, that can raise to £3 million before you have to pay any tax. The Prime Minister's used that number, the most favourable one, this morning. And then the inheritance tax will be 20%, not the 40% the rest of us would have to pay, and it's payable over 10 years. Now, the argument has been from government that about a quarter of farms will be affected and only a handful of farmers will actually pay it. They base it on that agricultural property relief. These are actual claims made by farmers in 2021, and they're banded, we can see, by the value of the estate. What we're interested in is farms that get above that £1 million figure, above the new thresholds. And the Chancellor and the Treasury say you add up those categories above £1 million, I can break it down a bit more, just 462 claims in a single year. Now, that's actual deaths and estates that have been passed on. Quite a small number. Of course, not every farmer is going to be claiming every year. The National Farmers Union say, in fact, the figure that could be affected, potentially above that threshold, is much, much larger. This is the net worth of farms, figures from the Department of the Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs, so official figures. Look, 10% of farms are worth less than £250,000. But look, net worth, almost half, 49%, this black bar, are worth £1.5 million or more. And that is why the National Farmers Union say that these are farms in England. That's about potentially 45,000, 50,000 farms could be affected. And that's where the discrepancy lies. Essentially, it's an argument between farmers who have died and passed on their estates and those that potentially could. Two more things to say, if there's time. What's the government trying to do here? It's trying to deal with the people who are sheltering wealth in farming because of those 100% tax relief. This is who's been buying farmland over the last, this is from big land agents over the last 10 years. The red bar here is people who describe themselves as farmers, family farmers, and we might call them. This year, in the first 3 quarters, just 31% of land has been bought by people who say they're farmers. The rest has been bought by lifestyle investors, private investors. You might think of lifestyle, Jeremy Clarkson, we saw him, Alex James, the former Blur basis, they have moved onto farms, and institutional investors at the top here. So investors and those who are deploying money they've made elsewhere in farming outnumber actual farmers buying land. This has become, the government was essentially a tax shelter they want to address. The challenge is where you set the bar so you don't catch these farmers who are asset rich in their land and their equipment, but they are cash poor. Let's just look at just how quite cash poor they are. This is numbers for croppable farms, horticulture, arable land. Like this is farm business profits over the last 4 years. Look at the year 2023 to 2024. Profits, average profits, so that's from the largest multi-million pound estates to the smallest small holding, less than £50,000 of profit, less than half of the year before. It's been a dreadful year for British farms. And the argument is, if you've got an inheritance tax bill of £2 million over 10 years, that's still £20,000 a year. even for an average farm, that's getting on for half your profit. And so the only option might be to sell. Of course, you will have the proceeds of a farm that's land product is worth a lot of money. So this is relative pain. But the argument is, of course, that that land might go out of cultivation, or it might go on to those institutional investors that the government has been trying to tax. The issue all here is all about where you set the bar and who suffers under potential inheritance tax claims.
And Paul, that's the really interesting thing here, isn't it? That when you look at those figures, and what I've taken away from what you just said, is that there are a lot of people, wealthy people, buying land at the moment in the UK who are not going to be farmers because they want to avoid paying inheritance tax. And, you know, there are small farmers affected, but at the end, the government is saying that this is also taking them on, if you like, as well.
Precisely, and this is, if you ask any tax lawyer, if there is 100% relief from any tax, that is where they will look to send money. And I mean, Jeremy Clarkson, he's become the front man for these protests, and he has made arguments that farmers have supported about the realities of the farming industry in his television show. But he said himself, one of the attractions of buying the farm, which is losing money and still does on its own terms, was that there was no inheritance tax. So money has poured in to this area. Now, much of that land remains in cultivation. It is producing food. The business model is just bigger. But the government is trying to address this sheltering of wealth. And how we deal with wealth taxes, of course, is a real challenge because they're treated differently to income. For example, one of the issues here is that land increases in value, right? So that's pushing up the value of farms, and it's going to push, as time goes on, the value of that land rises. It will push more farms up above those thresholds. But there's an argument that that land accrues value, but it doesn't face capital gains tax currently. Now, other gains you might make from business property, you will have to pay. So there's a real balance here, and much of it comes back to this. What do we mean by family farm? We all have an idea in our heads of where we'd like our food to come from and the kind of people, hard-working, passing farms to the generation. But the reality in an industry, in a farming economy that is so strained and produces such small profits and revenue from those who are earning the money, is that setting that bar in a way that protects the right kind of farm but delivers, prevents people hiding wealth the Exchequer thinks they're due a slice of. That is fearsomely difficult. Wherever this line had been set, and the Conservatives who've been asked to do this by the Treasury in the past have said this number is way too low and they resisted it, wherever it was set, there was bound to be complaint. But ultimately, it's about making that judgment. Treasury thinks it will raise, at best, £500 million. The question, ultimately, I'm guessing, politically, will be whether that is a price worth paying.
And just very finally and quickly, Paul, if you can, on that, what we're hearing today from the Treasury, from the government, is they are not going to U-turn on this.
Absolutely right. The language appears to be they're holding firm. The Chancellor put out a statement this morning in response to these protests. Some of the arguments are familiar. The black hole in the public finances, everyone needs to do their bit. They're talking about the money they are putting into farming. But at the moment, it feels like this is a row they're willing to have and weather. But don't all political U-turns start that way? I'm not qualified to say which way it will go. But at the moment, it seems that the Treasury is going to stick to its guns and farmers will have to wear this.
OK, Paul, great analysis. Thank you very much indeed. Paul Clarkson there, our economics and business correspondent, live in Westminster. Well, let's speak to Jeremy Moody now. He's Secretary and Advisor to the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers, which actually values farm estates. As I say, there's been a lot of confusion, a lot of disputes about the numbers in this. Jeremy, as far as you understand it, how many farms do you think could be caught up in these changes?
I think we're being misled by a number of things here. The first is that the figures that government were relying on during the budget debate was simply those who are claiming agricultural property relief. So that's just land and buildings and dwellings. It excludes the livestock, the machinery, the crops in store and everything else. And that's a very significant part of the value of a farming business, and that was ignored. So the first figures that came out were misleading to that extent. Also misleading because they include a lot of land that has been bought by people who are relatively or more wealthy that is below the £1 million threshold. Those will remain, of course, protected by the £1 million threshold, but those people below that are not necessarily farmers. We had paperwork out last night from the Treasury looking at some of the BPR analysis, and it's hard to do. But on the basis of looking through those figures quickly and looking at people expecting to pay tax, because it's not just that number of 400 or 500 a year that we're looking at. If we add more for BPR, the business property relief on livestock and the rest, and then think about this over a generation, the taxpayers who are likely to die with farm assets over that period, even on the government figures, you get to something like 20,000. And we think the government are underestimating the exposure of farm businesses to this. When an average cereals farm has a net worth of 3.1 million after debts, that requires 4 owners to meet the government's challenge.
In saying that, I mean, you know, the Chancellor has said there are further exemptions beyond that £1 million figure, up to 3 million if it's passed on to children and it's owned by a married couple, which I assume would be quite a few of these farms. As in, there are exemptions beyond that much talked about £1 million figure.
Yeah. The answer to that is yes and no. There are those other nil rate bands. There's the first 325,000 that any taxpayer gets. And that is there, firstly, to cover all your personal effects. You essentially have to be a monk with no personal assets to be able to bring your agricultural business and land into that 325,000. So it's there but not there. It will get used on other things. And then the second 175,000 is if you have occupied a house that you wish to give to a descendant, which of course is not always true in every case. A tenant farmer living in the tenant farmhouse would have no ability to pass that house down. And once you're looking at an estate above 2 million, you start losing that 175,000 immediately. So it's a misleading, it's an attempt to provide a simple, reassuring answer for something that's simply not as neat as that, and does assume that you've got absolutely nothing else in your life but your tractor.
But instead, I mean, the government would turn around and say they're trying to be fair here. They've put up taxes on pretty much every business in this country. They would argue to plug the public finances. That's a different political argument. But they would say it's about fairness. Farming is already subsidised, and that this is making a less generous package for farmers, sorry, a very generous package for farmers, a little less generous. That's true, isn't it?
Well, I think there's a point here to make that actually the government's changes are increasing the tax burden on all privately owned family businesses, whether farming or otherwise. It's simply that APR is in the mix alongside the business property relief that a printer, a pub, a livestock market, an accountancy firm could all claim. But moving back into this, I think the government intended probably that this be a relief for, as you've said, the small family farm. They've simply misunderstood what is a small family farm these days with the kind of economics that your correspondent was outlining. They've simply come in too low for their own purpose and are digging in on data that does not describe reality.
OK. Do you think they'll have to U-turn on this?
Well, have to is rather imperative. It would be easier if they found a way to resolve this among the larger problems they've created in terms of the taxation of business that generates wealth in this country. Those are political decisions they have to make. This is the fuse that has lit farming reaction in a way we haven't seen in this country for well over a century.
OK, wow. Jeremy, appreciate that. Jeremy Moody there joining us from the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers. Thank you. Let's stick with this story. I say only one real story in town today. Let's speak to Rob Hitch. He is an accountant at Dodd & Co, who specialises in farming. Rob, very good morning to you. Let's kind of look at this on a wider picture if we can. You know, there is a big argument today that lots of farmers are asset wealthy, but they are cash poor, if you like, because their margins are massively squeezed. And fundamentally, isn't that the problem here? It's not actually the argument about inheritance tax. That is an argument. But it's about the fact that farmers struggle, and they struggle because we all expect to have cheap food in this country. Isn't that the kind of big macro discussion that we should be having?
Quite possibly. I mean, you could argue that land prices have been way out of kilter with the earning capacity for a very long time, you know, and we're in a position now whereby some farmers may face an IHT liability. if we look at our businesses, probably, like the NFU analysis, there's probably 50% of them at least, I would think, would pay IHT if they hold all the assets at death. I suppose the key thing is, does that actually happen? A lot of business owners pass assets down during lifetime, which you can do relatively easily, and that will probably minimise the risk to a lot of businesses.
I suppose what I'm trying to get at here, Rob, is there'll be a lot of people watching, a lot of people who run businesses, a lot of people who've got money, some people who don't, who say, well, we all have to pay inheritance tax if we're wealthy enough to do so. Why is farming special? Why should farming be any different?
I don't think it's farming. Farming gets a special relief in that it gets agricultural property relief, but it gets the same relief as businesses, which they've had for 40 years as well. So it is protecting wealth generation and business assets that are within people's hands. Now, in most cases, it is possible to pass those down during lifetime, but they become potentially exempt transfers. So you've given it away, you must survive 7 years before it drops out of your estate. Now, if you're young enough, you can insure against that. But the change to the rules today effectively means that if you gave something away on the 29th of October, you're fine. And if you gave something away on the 30th of October, you're not. Now, if you're 60, that's probably doable. If you're 75 or 80, that's a terrible position to find yourself in. And you just think the government haven't sort of foreseen some of the problems that these rules might create for people that have followed one, been playing on under one set of rules for 40 years and then suddenly found themselves under another. Okay. I don't think the farmers I speak to, I don't think they're completely antagonistic about if this is a tax that's here and we have to plan around it, and it's one of those risks that the business takes on, and we have to plan and make decisions in good time. But there are a certain cohort of people who will not have that time to do it. This will collect most tax from people who die in the next 7 years, most of which are over 70 already. So I can't imagine that is what the government intended.
Yeah. So it's essentially the lack of consultation, I think, is kind of what you're trying to say about this. Just finally, Rob, we've heard from Jeremy Clarkson saying if this continues on, it is over for farming. We see people there talking about the death of the family farm, some suggesting that this will kill off farming in this country. Is that hyperbole? I mean, it sounds to me like it's hyperbole. You talk to farmers, you deal with them. I mean, is this the death nail for family farming in this country?
I can't see it being that. People want to farm and people will continue to farm and people will continue to pass farms down. They just won't be able to do it as freely on death. So they will need a lot more planning. There'll have to be a lot earlier discussions about succession, which maybe some other businesses do, which is why we're not hearing so much, uproar from the wider business community about the BPR changes. But it will hurt a certain cohort, generally old people who can't make gifts and survive 7 years. And that seems brutal. And as I say, probably needs to have some sort of change. And the government, you would hope, would see some sense in providing a sort of window for those sort of people to not find them. Because we're going to find some farms, as you point out, if there is an IHT charge, they don't generate enough cash necessarily to pay that bill.
Okay.
Even paying it over 10 years, some of them would, some of them might have a problem. Well, the last thing I suspect the government wants is a number of farms being sold that were in a generation for three generations of farms, and the guys died at 80 and there's an IHT charge. Whereas if he'd given it away on the 29th of November, nothing would have happened.
Okay.
So that's the real problem.
Okay. Really fascinating stuff. And we will be hearing from the NFU at those protests in Westminster a little later on this morning. Rob, for now, thank you very much indeed. Rob Hitch there joining us. I'm just going to bring you some breaking news away from what's happening with those protests, and that is from Bristol, actually, and that is that the getaway driver, Anthony Snook, 45, has been jailed at Bristol Crown Court for life, with a minimum term of some 38 years for the murders of teenagers Mason Rist and Max Dixon during a machete attack. So that is Anthony Snook has been jailed for a minimum of 38 years for the murders of 2 teenagers. We'll have more on that with Wilf coming up at midday. You're watching Business Live, though. We're going to take a quick break. Up next, we'll have the latest, continuing our coverage of that farmers' protest in Westminster today. Stay tuned.
It's like a football final with only one team on the pitch. This isn't just a call to vote, but a call to remember. The freedom fought for by the African National Congress.
I'm Yusra Al-Bagher, Sky's Africa correspondent based in Johannesburg, South Africa.
A cyclone and 2 burst dams wiped out hundreds of generational homes.
This was the second dam that the floodwaters hit before it tore into Derna.
We are in the heart of Nairobi, and we're watching as protesters were heavily tear gassed.
The sheer fearlessness and persistence of these guys is astonishing. We help you understand the world with us. I remember going into the iconic Omdurman market in the heart of Sudan's capital for the first time since the war started. And this is what's left of it. Bullet holes through buildings, shelled balconies, bullet cases on the floor. I witnessed the complete destruction of a place linked to my childhood memories and the lives of millions of people. This is insane. This was a bustling residential area. So many friends who lived here. My most memorable interview was with a 15-year-old boy who'd survived being stranded on a migrant boat on its way from Senegal to the Canary Islands.
After 13 days, our food, water and fuel supply ran out.
I felt awe when we saw the mountain gorillas in Rwanda.
We call him the king of the jungle. This is the alpha silverback.
Sky News, get the full story first. Yusra Al-Bagher, Sky News.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Very welcome back to Business Live. Let's return to our big story that we're covering this morning, those developing protests in Westminster by farmers. Well, the head of the National Farmers Union has told Sky News that his members feel betrayed by the government after saying last year that they wouldn't change the tax rules. Let's have a listen in.
They simply have to move on this. The policy they've designed is very, very poorly thought through. The foundations of the numbers behind it are questionable. Even DEFRA and the Treasury can't agree on them. And then when we look at the human impact of this policy, they've designed a policy which has got the elderly generation in the twilight of their careers absolutely in the centre of this policy with no way to plan for it. They've given everything to this country to produce the food the country needs, and they can't plan their way through it. That is simply unacceptable.
As I say, thousands of farmers are gathering in Westminster today. They are saying that this is effectively the death of the family farm, given these inheritance tax changes that will make a significant difference. They argue to thousands of farmers. The government argues, actually, it's more like hundreds of farms. But effectively, the agricultural states will now have to pay 20% inheritance tax above a new £1 million threshold. And that's why they've taken to the streets in Westminster. Well, let's speak to Victoria Vivian, who's president of the Countryland Business Association, and joins us. Victoria, thank you for joining us. The big argument or the big discussion today is about the numbers that we've talked about. What's the feeling amongst farmers? How angry are they this morning?
I think they all feel under immense pressure. It seems like we have a government that neither knows anything about our business and cares less.
And when you say cares less, lots of people would point out farming subsidised by taxpayers as it is, and that this is a generous system still compared to others who have to deal with inheritance tax.
That we have payments that are being made to support good food prices for people in the supermarkets. Farmers are not making vast profits at the cost of the taxpayer.
But isn't that the point then, that actually we need to be more realistic, that this shouldn't be a discussion about tax if it's about fairness? It should be about the fact that farmers just don't earn enough money for their goods. It's a wider problem, isn't it?
Well, there may well be a wider problem, but today the discussion is about tax and whether or not farms are going to end up having to sell their land in order to pay an unfair tax.
OK, but then lots of people, but it's not, people would say it's not unfair. It's still generous compared to other people who have to deal with inheritance tax.
Well, inheritance tax is a tax on personal wealth. This is a tax on a business. And it's a business that has vanishingly small profitability. And of course, it's also a business that has very narrow kind of return on capital. So it's not a tax on personal wealth. As somebody said to me recently, you can't spend an acre.
OK, we've run out of time, Victoria, sorry, and I really wanted to speak more about this, but we have run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you very much for joining us here on Business Live this morning. As I say, those protests are continuing and our coverage will continue throughout the day. We are expecting to hear from the NFU and Jeremy Clarkson in the next hour or so. I'll be back at 4:30 with Business Live. Up next, though, it's Jane Secker with the very latest headlines. I'll see you later.
Hello, you're watching Sky News Today with me, Jane Secker. It's 12 o'clock. These are the headlines. Farmers take their inheritance tax protest to Westminster, calling for the scrapping of controversial changes announced in the budget. Among them, TV presenter and farmer Jeremy Clarkson, who delivered this message to the government.
Jeremy, what's your word to the government? You're live on Sky.
Please back down. Please back down.
Also today, Vladimir Putin lowers the threshold for Russia's use of nuclear weapons on the 1,000th day of the war in Ukraine. A man who acted as a getaway driver for 4 teenagers who stabbed a 15 and 16-year-old to death in Bristol is jailed for at least 38 years. Winter arrives as snow falls across the UK with a number of severe weather warnings in place. Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Hundreds of farmers are protesting in Westminster, urging the government to scrap plans to introduce inheritance tax on farms worth more than £1 million. Some farmers are threatening to strike and even withhold meat and vegetables from supermarkets as a possible last resort. But the government insists the shelves won't be empty and that they won't bow to the protesters. Those gathering in Westminster have the support of some famous faces, including TV presenter Jeremy Clarkson, who owns a farm and who many farmers credit with raising awareness of their situation. He's accused the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, of a blunderbuss decision.
Jeremy, what's your word to the government? You're live on Sky.
Please back down. Please back down. This is where the food comes from.
Yeah.
If the government ends farming, which is seemingly what it wants to do,
yeah,
where do we get our food from?
Yeah. If they go on strike, then what?
I don't think farmers will go on strike.
No.
I think there's a lot more impactful things. I think farmers can do better than that. I've got some ideas.
Keep moving back, please.
Sorry, guys.
Jeremy, for farmers. Keep moving,
Sorry.
Keep moving, please, guys. Sorry, of course we are. Sorry, guys, can we keep moving?
How bad could this be for farmers, Jeremy? It's the end.
In a hard right, Kenny.
If you actually stop and pay attention, it's the end.
Well, earlier we heard from the Environment Secretary, Steve Reed, who defended the planned changes and insisted that the government is committed to supporting farmers.
We inherited a £22 billion black hole from the previous government, and the previous Chancellor of the Exchequer covered the scale of that problem up. So none of us knew how difficult the problem would be when we were coming into government. But this government's commitment to farming and to farmers is absolute. That's why we've allocated £5 billion to farming in the budget. That's the biggest amount of money in our country's history for sustainable food production. But we have to plug that £22 billion black hole in our public finances. Otherwise, we can't fix our public services like the broken National Health Service. So it's only right that we've had to ask the wealthiest landowners and the biggest farms to pay their fair share. But I would emphasise only around 500 farms will be affected. The vast majority of farmers will pay no more under the new scheme than they do under the current one.
Well, the head of the National Farmers Union has told Sky News his members feel betrayed after the government said last year that they wouldn't change the tax rules.
They simply have to move on this. The policy they've designed is very, very poorly thought through. The foundations of the numbers behind it are questionable, even DEFRA, and the Treasury can't agree on them. And then when we look at the human impact of this policy, they've designed a policy which has got the elderly generation in the twilight of their careers absolutely in the centre of this policy with no way to plan through it. They've given everything to this country to produce the food the country needs, and they can't plan their way through it. That is simply unacceptable.
Well, let's just bring you a bit of breaking news coming from the Ukraine-Russia conflict. There's been a lot of discussion about the use of these ATACMS missiles that the US has provided for Ukraine and allowed them to use inside Russia. Well, we're hearing from Russian sources the debris of one ATACMS missile fell on the territory of a military facility inside Russia in the Bryansk region. This is coming from the Russian Defense Ministry via RIA. The Russian anti-missile system apparently downed 5 out of 6 of these missiles. And the Russian Defense Ministry says Ukraine hit Russia with these missiles. Let's bring in our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who joins us from Rio de Janeiro, where the G20 is taking place. Deborah, the fact that we knew that Ukraine were going to be able to use these missiles in a slightly different way, was certainly with a further reach, this perhaps comes as no surprise. The fact that Russia says that these missiles have been used, can we believe them here?
Well, the Ukrainian military said earlier today that it did launch an attack against Russian targets in the Bryansk region. They have not confirmed the use of these army tactical missile system, ATACMS ballistic missiles, the weapon system that the US has supplied to Ukraine and has now given permission to Ukraine to use beyond its borders inside Russia. But that should be no surprise. What benefit does it give to Ukraine to confirm the use of these weapons? The only way that they want to demonstrate their use is by actually firing them. So it is worth listening to what the Russian Defense Ministry is claiming, and according to Russian reports, it's saying that the Ukrainians have fired 6 of these ATACMS missiles into Russian territory, claiming that 5 were shot down. 1, therefore, clearly got through. It'll be interesting to understand the extent of the damage caused by these missiles. But the actual tactical use of the systems is one thing. The strategic response from Russia could well be another. You have the Russian president up until now warning the West of dire consequences should the US, or the UK for that matter, grant the Ukrainians the permission to use these longer range missile systems. For the US, it sees it the ATACMS ballistic missile. For the UK, it's the Storm Shadow cruise missile, that should they grant that permission, that they are playing with fire, that they could trigger a global conflict. And it's no coincidence, therefore, that the Russians today are announcing or finalising what was already in the planning, this lowering of the threshold of when Russia would consider using nuclear weapons in response to an attack. Under this updated doctrine, the Russian military could resort to a nuclear strike if the country is under conventional attack, and which is a lowering with, for example, the kinds of missiles that you're seeing at the moment, which is a different change of words. Before, the caveat of when a nuclear strike, a nuclear retaliation would be considered by Russia was in response to a nuclear attack or a conventional attack that threatens the very existence of the state. Of course, we know, and British and American officials repeatedly say, that Russia does not want a nuclear war because there would be no winners. But clearly an incredibly important and worrying, well, but obviously unsurprising development.
Deborah, thank you very much for that. And on the fact that Russia has talked about changing their nuclear doctrine, we just had a statement from the UK Prime Minister's spokesperson saying it would be fair to say that the nuclear doctrine move from Moscow is the latest example of irresponsibility that we have seen from the depraved Russian government. So, Deborah, a strongly worded response from the UK government to what President Putin has announced today.
Yes, and I think we just have to wait and see how Russia does respond. The US and the UK officials have publicly and privately for a long time now cautioned against heeding Russian nuclear saber-rattling, believing that it's intended to delay or to defer decisions by Western allies to give increased support to Ukraine. Instead, for the UK and, well, for the US in particular in this instance, Joe Biden is reported to have given this permission to the Ukrainians to use these longer-range ballistic missile systems on Russian soil. Remember, these are weapons that have been used against Russian targets inside Ukraine for a while now. But he made that decision in response to escalation on the Russian side, with the introduction of thousands of North Korean soldiers into the fight inside Russia, battling a Ukrainian incursion in the Kursk region. It's interesting, though, that these strikes, and we await confirmation if they were ATACMS missiles used in the strike against the Bryansk region. It's not inside Kursk, so it would, if it is confirmed, suggest that the Americans have given a wider remit for Ukraine to be able to launch these weapons against targets that they deem to be a threat to their country. And that really does underline the US and the British thinking here. They say, when they talk about it, that this isn't about attacking Russia, it's about defending Ukraine. Russia has been able to use the fact that Ukraine has had its hands tied by these limitations in the use of the weapons that they've been given by the West, with not being able to strike deep into Russia, from where Russia is launching long-range missile attacks, drone attacks, aircraft strikes on Ukrainian territory. So this really is about trying to even out the battlefield, make it a fairer fight. But one final point too, it's not a game-changing, war-ending development for Ukraine. There are limitations with the use of these new weapon systems, not just in the range, but also in the quantity. For example, for British Storm Shadow cruise missiles, we don't know yet whether the UK has granted the Ukrainians permission to use them, but we do know that there is only a very finite stockpile of them, and they take a long time to build and replenish the supplies.
Deborah Haynes for us there at the G20 in Rio. Good to get your reaction to this breaking news. Thanks very much. Well, let's bring in our defence and security analyst, Professor Michael Clark, who's here in the studio. This appears to be a development, Michael, but no surprise, as Deborah was saying, that these potentially have been used deeper into Russia.
No, the Ukrainians, once they got permission, were going to use them as soon as possible, particularly to try to hold on to as much as they can of Kursk. What they've just seen it, as you were reading it, the Russians are saying that 6 ATACMS were fired and they shot down 5 of them. I think they'd have done very well if they shot down 5 of them. I'd be amazed if they shot down 1 of them, to be honest. So I don't know what the numbers will be. But ATACMS is very hard to shoot down. I mean, it's a ballistic missile with up to a 200-mile range. I mean, when that's coming at you, there's not much you can do against it, to be honest. So, yes, they've been used. They may make a difference in Kursk, but as Deborah was saying, they won't make a difference to the war in general because there's too much of a restriction on what the Ukrainians can do with them.
And the fact that these ones have been used, does this hasten the opportunity for them to use British Storm Shadow missiles?
It does. I mean, again, I'm surprised that they haven't been given that option already. And there's a whole series of politics about this. It's not entirely clear what the British government's line is on it because it's changed a bit. It keeps shifting, really. They keep finding different reasons why they're not able to give permission, though they want to. And I think now that the ATACMS decision has been made by President Biden, I'd be surprised if the Storm Shadow clearance was not coming fairly quickly now. The issue with Storm Shadow is not so much the permission, but how many can they use? That we're talking about the low hundreds here, whereas the Ukrainians need several hundred or into the thousands of these things to make a real difference. So, yes, they'd be glad to use another 100 or so Storm Shadow or Scalp, the French version of it. They'd be glad to use them. Again, it won't be game-changing, but it would help them, certainly in the Kursk region, and maybe, in the case of Storm Shadow and Scalp, down in the southwest in Donetsk, where, they're under great pressure from the Russians edging forward half a kilometre a day.
And what do you make of President Putin's talking about this new nuclear doctrine? It was expected that they would move the Gold Coast.
Oh, you could put money on it. That every time the West crosses a threshold with aid to Ukraine, the Russians make some sort of nuclear statement. And you could put money on when it was going to be. I mean, this goes back to the 25th of September. There's a biannual conference in Moscow about deterrence. And President Putin said then, we're working on our deterrence doctrine. We need to update it in light of circumstances. So that was the clearance to say, I'll make an announcement when I think I need to. And lo and behold, that announcement was made yesterday. Here I am signing into a decree the new doctrine. Now, it doesn't really matter what the new doctrine says. I mean, doctrine is the way you justify the force structure that you have. When the chips are down, when things are dangerous or desperate, you don't worry about doctrine, you just do what you think you need to do. So this is a way of attracting attention. It gets us talking about it. And the more we in the West are talking about nuclear doctrine and Russia's nuclear power, the more he likes it because he thinks he's got the West frightened. I mean, he has got quite a lot of the West frightened, but not in Britain. And the statement from Downing Street was pretty clear. We expected it. We're not impressed by this. This is bluster. But that's not really what they think in Germany. I mean, in Germany, both the public and political establishment are really scared of this man now.
Well, they're closer to him, aren't they?
Absolutely. And they're closer to him, not just geographically, but economically too. The Germans are suffering more economically from sanctions than most of us in Europe. And so it's both an economic reaction and a sort of classic German reaction. I mean, Germany's national sport really is dithering. And they love to dither. And they're going in circles at the moment over the Ukraine war, dithering all the time.
OK, Michael, interesting analysis. Good to talk to you. Thanks very much. Well, let's return to the story that we started the hour with. Hundreds of farmers are protesting in Westminster. Well, part of the dispute is just how many farmers will be affected by the change in agricultural relief and by how much financially. Our business and economics correspondent Paul Kelso has been taking a look at the numbers.
Yeah. Jane, the discussion here has been about inheritance tax. Nobody likes to pay it. Actually, very few of us as private individuals do, about 4%. But at the moment, farmers don't pay any, and that's because they receive relief, 100% relief. 100% means no tax. In two categories they can claim. Agricultural property relief, so that's farmland, farm buildings, got woodland there as well. They can also claim business property relief. Not all of it relates to farming, but your cereals, livestock, equipment like tractors, any cottages you've turned into a holiday let to diversify your income, they can all benefit from relief. So all of that gets zero inheritance tax when it's passed on. Well, Rachel Reeves wants to change that. Very briefly talk you through how she wants to do it. There'll be thresholds, £1 million for every farm tax-free. That goes up to £1.5 million, when there's about £500,000 that everybody benefits from with inheritance tax relief. It's a couple passing on the farm. It could be as high as £3 million before you pay any tax. That tax will be at 20% and payable over 10 years. That's half the rate that individuals pay it. And the government says under these rules, these thresholds, only about a quarter of farms will be affected and just a few hundred every year. And they base that number on these figures. These are figures for actual claims for agricultural property relief. These are from 2021. They're banded by the value of the estate. The ones we're interested in, these ones, above £1 million, they'd be getting above the thresholds we just talked about. If you add up those claims in a single year, just 462 farms. That's the basis for the government's figure. But remember those reliefs we talked about? Just a quick reminder, the agriculture and business, well, they get banded together. And once you add tractors and combine harvesters to farmland, you're going to start bumping up more quickly above the levels of relief. And that is what the National Farmers Union say means perhaps half of all farms in England could be affected. These are figures for the Department of the Environment, and they, again, look at the percentage of farms by the size of the estate. Look, 10% less than £250,000. This is the number at this end we care about. 49% this black bar worth £1.5 million or more. That could be up to 50,000 farms potentially exposed to inheritance tax. And there's the gap between actual claims the government says counts and the potential exposure. Two very quick things. Why is the government doing this? Well, they think people are using that 100% tax relief as a haven for wealth. This is who's been buying land in the last few years from agencies. This is land that's been sold in the first 3 quarters of this year. Just look at this. A third, 31%, the red bar, is people who define themselves as farmers. The rest, the other 70-odd%, lifestyle farmers like Jeremy Clarkson, like Andrew Lloyd Webber, who's there today, then private investors and institutional investors. And some of these people, some things, is putting money in to farming because it will save them tax. The question when you get a tax bill for a farmer, though, it's how on earth you pay it off. They are asset rich through land and property, but they are cash poor, and this is pretty stark. This is farm business profit for cropping farms, so arable, horticulture, the stuff they grow. Just look at this, about just under £100,000 last year per farm on average. Less than half of that last year, under £50,000 of profit. If you've got a £2 million inheritance tax bill, even payable over 10 years, 200,000, you know, once you break that down and you've got profits that small, the option for some farmers on the margin will be they will have to sell their farms. Of course, they'll have the proceeds, and that will make them wealthy in the eyes of some. Perhaps the question here is inheritance tax fair? Perhaps it should be. How on earth do we get farming to pay in a way that keeps small and large farms viable?
Paul, thanks very much for that. Breaking down the numbers there. Let's just bring you a bit of breaking news coming to us from Avon and Somerset Police. And this is about a murder that happened back in 1967. Police officers reinvestigating the murder of Louisa Dunn in Bristol, also known as Louise Dunn, have made an arrest. They say a 92-year-old man from the Ipswich area in Suffolk was arrested on suspicion of murder and rape and has been taken into custody for questioning. There was a review of the case which started back in 2023, which included further forensic examination of items relating to the case, and that has led to this arrest today. Louisa was found dead in her home in Britannia Road in Easton in Bristol on the 28th of June back in 1967. The cause of her death was strangulation and asphyxiation, and she'd also been raped. But for 6 decades, it has remained unsolved. Well, now there's been an arrest, a 92-year-old man, following further forensic examination of the case. The police say that they've identified and spoken to Louisa Dunn's next of kin to update them on this development, and specialist family liaison officers are now supporting them. They're not going to comment further, though, while this case is still active. So that there, an arrest after 6 decades in the 1967 murder of Louisa Dunn in Bristol. You're watching Sky News Today. Coming up, with snow sweeping parts of the UK, we'll look at what the Met Office is calling the first taste of winter and the disruption it could bring. 45 pro-democracy activists are jailed in Hong Kong in what has been described as a landmark national security trial.
I'm James Matthews and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. Donald Trump, it would appear, is about to learn his fate. There's no doubting the strength of this hurricane as it roars through. Sky News, get the full story first. Do you fear a fourth indictment? Is it a draw?
He's from Sky News. He's from Sky News. He's entitled to ask me questions.
Trust in politics is at an all-time low. What's going wrong and can we fix it? It's from Liz. She wants to know, why is there still no sign of the Labour Party electing a woman as leader?
It's sort of embarrassing. You know, it takes a very strong man to be leader, but it takes an even stronger man to support a woman for leader.
If you want to be mean to politicians, like, crack on. The activists that go out and make elections happen, I kind of feel like just don't be horrible to them. Be polite to them in the same way that they're polite to you.
Keir Starmer has got us into government with a big majority. He was completely clear before the election that he wasn't going to be able to do the two-child benefit policy, but I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't an early thing that comes along.
I went up to Gordon Brown and said, hello? No, yes, where is it? I said, found all these Tory candidates breaking land. Let me see it, This is brilliant, brilliant.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
Snowy conditions have caused school closures, train cancellations and road delays across the UK this morning. Let's take a look at some of the images. Here's a snow-covered balcony and garden in Derby. Parts of Buckinghamshire also saw heavy snowfall overnight. And it was even snowing very lightly in North London too. You just got a flavour of that there. Well, earlier we spoke to senior Met Office presenter Aidan McGibbon, who told us more about what to expect from the weather across the week, where we might see further snowfall.
Forecast is for it to stay cold over the next few days. Increasingly, it will be northern and eastern and western coasts that will see snow showers. Plenty of sunshine inland, but it's going to feel very cold up until the weekend. And then in the weekend, we're going to see Atlantic weather return, so some very wet and windy weather moving in. A transient period of snow across central and northern parts of the UK as that happens on Saturday.
Well, Sky correspondent Daniel Henry is in Nottingham for us. And Daniel, for the kids who've got a snow day at school, I imagine they're absolutely thrilled today. But for those commuting or those struggling to get about, it's causing some issues.
Well, there are people who simply chose not to commute. And to be honest, when you see the number of cancellations that were happening across the East Midlands Railway, which is a common railway here up in Nottingham, you can't blame them. You know, there were what, 50, more than half of railway services cancelled or delayed as a result of the snow. And a number of schools across Nottingham, schools and colleges, 22 I counted here in Nottingham that were closed as a result of the snow. Across England and Wales, Sky News counted 64 schools that have been closed as a result of the snow. But if you look behind me, if I kind of step out of shot, you can see where some of those people have ended up. People are just enjoying the snow and making the most of that, getting on the sledges, and you know, the bibbing you can hear to my right is someone who is on some sort of motorised tractor, you know, which has really kind of caught my eye. But it's a lovely day here. You know, people are really, you know, making the most of the fact that the snow is out, and they've come out here with their friends and family to make snowmen and enjoy the first taste of winter, as the Met Office were describing it. Up to 12 centimetres of snow has already been recorded around here. And, you know, that's to say, people are just trying to enjoy themselves. But there are some people I spoke to who have found it tricky. You know, there was one person who I spoke to earlier, works in the salon, saying that their salon had to close as a result of the snow because they knew that the bookings wouldn't come in. So that's a day's taking loss for them. But for most people, certainly the kids, they're finding a way to make the most of it.
Watch out for snowballs, Daniel. Thanks so much. Some of the day's other news now, and 4 suspects have been identified by police investigating possible criminal charges in the post office scandal. Sources have told Sky News that among the offences being considered are perverting the course of justice and perjury. Hundreds of sub-postmasters were wrongly accused of stealing from their branches due to faulty software causing accounting errors. Dozens of retail bosses have signed a letter to the Chancellor warning that the budget will result in job losses and higher prices for shoppers. The letter says retailers won't be able to cope with the hit from higher national insurance contributions and living wage increases. A technical issue at British Airways has caused major delays to thousands of passengers, with some left stranded on the tarmac at multiple airports. Reports suggested dozens of flights were grounded and that communication systems were affected. The airline said the issue is now being resolved. To Hong Kong now, where 45 pro-democracy activists have been jailed after being accused by authorities of trying to overthrow the government. Some of the most prominent activists were given jail terms of between 4 and 10 years in what was described as a landmark national security trial. Our Asia correspondent Nicole Johnson sent this update.
This is the largest national security trial that we've seen in Hong Kong. 45 people have been sentenced. They've received sentences anywhere from 4 years to 10 years. They're basically accused of, in 2020, they held an unofficial election.
Just cutting away from that, because the Conservative Party leader, Kemi Badenoch, is addressing farmers down in Westminster. Let's listen in.
Who are watching what the Department for the Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs is doing. They're watching the Treasury. We are the team that are working for you. We know the burden that farmers are carrying. A lot of people think that farming is just a business. It is not just a business. It is a way of life. It is about family. It is about the land. It is about the environment. It is about our food. We cannot survive without you. I want you to know that we have your backs. We are all, and Neil is here too, Neil Hudson. We are all MPs who have rural constituents. We cover the rural communities. We know what farming is like. We understand that you have no certainty. We know that bad weather, a bad harvest could put you out of business. We know that you are buffeted every day by what happens all around the world. We know that you need protection. We understand that you have been doing this all your lives, that without you, we cannot eat. We understand the burden that farmers carry, not just for yourselves, but for the whole country. We understand how difficult it is when you're negotiating with supermarkets. We understand how difficult it is when you're looking at prices for fertilizer. We know what you are dealing with, and that is why we know how this tax will destroy your way of life, and that is why we are going to reverse it. But I want you all, I want you all to know this, that farming in this country is absolutely critical for growth. And it is also about the hope that we give to young people. I have a lot of young farmers in my constituency. Victoria, Robbie, and Neil do too. We speak to them, and they are worried. They don't want to have to pay inheritance tax and be paying off to the Treasury for 20, 30 years before they even start making a profit. They will leave farming, and if we don't have a next generation, there will be no future. So I want to say to all the young farmers out there, to all the young people out there, we are going to look after you. We are going to make sure that you have a future. We are doing this for you. It is not about us. This is about you. This is about making sure that your way of life continues, that our way of life continues. Farming is the backbone of this country. Without it, we cannot survive. We know that we haven't always got it right, but this policy is so obviously unfair, so obviously cruel. We will do everything we can to make sure that in a few years' time, if they do not U-turn now, we will reverse this tax. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Kemi.
Well, that the Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, talking to the crowd there, announcing that the Conservative government will reverse this tax should they get in at the next election if the Labour government doesn't carry out a U-turn. We think Jeremy Clarkson may be next up on the stage after Kemi Badenoch, so let's just listen back in.
Speaking. We don't know if he's going to make it on the stage, so could we all give him a big cheer to make sure he does make it onto the stage? Everybody, cheer! Right, while we wait for Jeremy to make himself available, I'm now going to have one last speaker. He's called Steve Perez. He is a farmer. He is also a hotelier. And his business is going to
Let's step away from that. We may well return when Jeremy Clarkson takes to the stage. And let's bring in Ed White, who's a farmer at the Slow Farming Company, which are based in Somerset. And he joins me now from our studios very close to that protest down in Westminster. Ed, very good to talk to you today. Why have you come down there? What message are you delivering to the government?
I've come down to show solidarity with my fellow farmers. Our farm is just under the threshold at the moment for inheritance tax, by the way we've divided up the farm. But a lot of my colleagues, a lot of local farmers are affected by it. We're also, all the issues with this are putting a block on future investment in a lot of farmers' decisions. We need to make a decision on to new chicken sheds or new cattle sheds, but with these changes that are last minute, we were told at a conference last year there was going to be no inheritance tax changes from Labour, and then they've rolled straight back on it and put them straight into action with no run-in, and it's causing major issues and a lot of mental health issues for farmers.
You talk about decisions that you're having to make and changes that you're having to make. How have the goalposts moved? How many times have the goalposts moved in recent years? I'm thinking back of things like Brexit as well, the loss of EU farming subsidies. How different is farming now to say, 10 years ago?
We've gone from being told to grow lots of food, produce lots of food. We want to be self-sufficient in agriculture. Then we have a switch to, we want to do environmental schemes. Farmers don't want to ruin the environment. We are here to promote the environment and also to feed the nation. Without us farming, all food ends up being imported, and with the loss of more and more family farms on a monthly basis, we're losing more and more of our sort of, stability to be able to self-sufficiently provide food for the country.
And what does that mean in terms of the kind of choices that you're having to make? And, you know, if you... I suppose some people who don't know much about farming will look at this and say, well, you know, you've got an industry, you just got to keep doing the same thing. How difficult is it to do the same thing year in, year out if the rules change in a year's time?
You can't forward plan. You wouldn't want to take out a mortgage now for 25 years to buy more land with the risk that in 3 years' time the government will change their mind how they want us to farm, or how they want us to go into a different sort of scheme. We get told this is a scheme for production of environmental schemes, and then that changes to actually no, make more food, or we don't want you growing any food at all. We'll pay you more money not to farm than we will to actually help you farm.
You're here down protesting at the Labour government and this budget, and it's a direct protest at what they've said in the budget. But we heard from Kemi Badenoch there saying that they understand farmers. Have the Conservative government protected farmers in the last 14 years, would you say?
I think there's been a lot of chopping and changing between schemes and how they're going to do it. Coming out of Brexit made a lot of changes to the industry. It hasn't settled down yet as to how farming is going to be supported from the previous government to this government. But this government have lied to us.
The government's saying it won't budge. What other action would you be prepared to take?
I think there are ideas coming into fruition that will become more clear after today, going forward.
If this budget hadn't been brought in, and if these changes to inheritance tax hadn't been brought in, how rosy was the future looking for farming?
It still wasn't rosy. Our profit margins are wafer thin. There isn't money in farming. We're being pushed further and further down the line from environmental schemes to the profits just aren't there. The money isn't there in farming for us to invest without a future plan long term from the governments.
And briefly, do you think you would be able to pass your farm on to your family?
At the moment we can. I'm the 5th generation on our farm, and I hope to pass on to our 6th generation.
Well, fingers crossed you do. Ed White, farmer at the Slow Farming Company, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
You're watching Sky News Today. Coming up, we are going to have more live coverage of those protests by farmers taking place in Westminster. We are expecting Jeremy Clarkson to speak on the stage shortly. We're also expecting an urgent question on the situation in Hong Kong imminently in the House of Commons. We'll bring that to you live. Jeremy Clarkson on the stage in Westminster. Let's listen in.
I'm not supposed to be talking, but we've got a few things to say, and I'm going to start with a bit of honesty. I lived in London 25, 30 years, and when I was here, like a lot of people who live in cities and go on Twitter, I thought farmers drove around in Range Rovers until February, and then all went skiing. And then about 5 years ago, I started farming. And I've come to understand just how unbelievably difficult it is, and complicated, and dangerous, and cold. Very cold. Even when we're harvesting, it's cold. And it's just the forest of costs that staggered me. £200,000. Somebody needs to turn their mics off. £200,000.
We need a medic.
Medic.
We need a medic to the right.
We have a medic over to...
by the building.
Building doesn't narrow it down, Ollie. I'm going to say...
to the right of the stage.
To the north of the stage at 3 o'clock. Okay, so, as we all know, everyone down there, you know a tractor. £200,000 for a medium-sized one. A combine, £500,000. All the equipment costs a fortune. And if you try to price what you're selling to accommodate that, there's just a lot of moaning. You get people saying, well, I shouldn't pay that. I can get a chicken from abroad. Yeah, you can. But it's so full of chlorine, it tastes like a swimming pool with a beak. And then you've got the environmentalists endlessly shouting at you, oh, you cows, they're altering the composition of the gases in the upper atmosphere, and your fertilizers ruining the trouty freshness of our streams and rivers. And I know sometimes you just think, what's the point? We're just trying to make breakfast, lunch and dinner, and it's just this endless whinging, and there's no money in it. And the regulations. Some of you down there will know what I'm on about when I say we got a lot of GS4 this year on the farm. And we were told, oh, the sheep will love that. No, they don't. They're standing looking at it in the same way that a 5-year-old looks at an olive. They don't want to eat it. And so we have all of this complication and all of this cost. And there's very, very little money in it. Very little money, as you know. And then we got the budget. Now, I know a lot of people all across the country in all walks of life took a bit of a kick on the shin with that budget. You lot got a knee in the nuts and a hammer blow to the back of the head. Because we had pickup trucks, double cab pickup trucks, being reclassified as company cars. 211% tax rise there. £50 carbon tax on a bag of fertiliser. The basic farm payments altered in such a way that we're getting a lot less than we thought we were going to get. And then there was the inheritance tax business. Honestly, I don't know where to start. I know you've heard a lot about it today, and I'm not going to dwell on that. I will just say this. Rachel Reeves has told us, what is it, 72%? 72% of farms are going to be unaffected by this. I've just been interviewed by Victoria Derbyshire for Newsnight. Let's see if we can educate her here, if she's still around, Victoria. How many people here, if you'd raise your hands, are from a family farm? I want to see, right. I hope we can see that. I hope we've got our cameras from the show up high to see. That's a lot of hands. Now, keep them up, and I want you to lower them if you think, and you've had time to work this out, you think you're going to be unaffected by the changes to APR and BPR. Put your hands down if you're going to be unaffected. Thank you. My case rests. I want Newsnight to see that. She was trotting out. Nobody's affected. Rachel Reeves says so. Since when was the BBC the mouthpiece of this infernal government? I've got to get the brakes on. The trouble is I'm off my tits on codeine and paracetamol up here. I don't know what I'm saying. But I do want to finish, if I may, with a message to the government. I do. Not a shouty one. It's this. for the sake of everybody here, and for all the farmers who are stuck at home today, paralysed by a fog of despair over what's been foisted upon them, I beg of the government to be big, to accept that this was rushed through, it wasn't thought out, and it's a mistake. That's the big thing to do, admit it, and back down. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. All right, everybody, Ollie's just asked me to ask you if you could all turn around now, because we'd like to get a photograph of the size of this protest. The camera's somewhere down near the cenotaph there. Hold up your placards, hold up your banners. Let's get a picture of this. And thank you once again, everybody. And thank you, Ollie. And thank you, Emily. And thank you, everybody who's put this amazing thing together at very short notice.
Jeremy Clarkson there, we should apologise for his slightly fruity language in some of that speech. I hope you weren't offended by that. Outside of our control, I'm afraid. But the strength of what his message to the government was, without doubt. He said, for the sake of everybody here and those paralysed by a fog of despair, he begs the government to be big, accept that this was rushed through and it was a mistake, and for the government to back down. He asked for a show of hands in the audience for those who were from family farms and those who didn't think that they were going to be affected by what the government has brought in this budget. He is down there. There are hundreds and hundreds of farmers down there in Westminster today, furious about the changes that have been foisted upon them, they say, by the government in this budget, the changes to inheritance tax regulation. We're going to return to that and that protest throughout the day on Sky. But as I mentioned earlier, an urgent question was due at past on the situation in Hong Kong. The Shadow Foreign Secretary, Priti Patel, asked it of the Foreign Office Minister, Annalise Dodds.
Right, we come to the urgent question. Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Department, who will make a statement on the government's response to the jailing of pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if I may, I would like to both thank the Right Honourable Member for her question on this important matter and, of course, welcome her to her new role. It's a real pleasure to be across the chamber from her this morning. I'm glad to reassure her that my colleague, the Minister for Indo-Pacific, has issued a statement on today's verdict. Minister West made clear that China's imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong has eroded the rights and freedoms of Hong Kongers. She made clear that the sentencing decision was a clear demonstration of the Hong Kong authorities' use of the NSL to criminalise political dissent. Indeed, as she said, the so-called NSL 45 were guilty only of exercising their rights as guaranteed under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Basic Law, of exercising their right to freedom of speech, assembly and of political participation. China's imposition of the NSL in Hong Kong has eroded the rights and freedoms of Hong Kongers, and the UK government will always stand up for the people of Hong Kong.
Foreign Secretary.
Speaker, the jailing of 45 pro-democracy campaigners in Hong Kong under the draconian national security law is appalling. It's a serious blow to freedoms in Hong Kong. The harsh application of this disturbing law to suppress people in Hong Kong cannot go unanswered. In government, my party consistently championed that this law should be repealed. We gave safe routes to BNOs needing protection, and I'm proud as Home Secretary then to have established that scheme. We also publish reports twice a year, Mr. Speaker, on the situation in Hong Kong to raise our grave concerns about the erosion of freedoms with the Chinese authorities and at the UN. Yesterday, the Prime Minister met President Xi and said he wanted a respectful relationship. A relationship where both countries try to avoid surprises. He even confirmed he had called in the application for the new Chinese embassy. But less than 24 hours later, the Sino-British declaration has been trampled on, yet again, Mr. Speaker, with this sentencing of 45 pro-democracy campaigners. Where does this leave the government's reset with Beijing? Did the Prime Minister actually secure any commitments on Hong Kong yesterday? Will the Prime Minister now be holding further conversations with President Xi to convey his concerns about this appalling jailing?
Why did the Minister this morning for the Indo-Pacific in her statement not call for the repeal of the national security law? Mr Speaker, the official number 10 readout from the Prime Minister's meeting failed to mention Jimmy Lai's case, and we understand the Prime Minister did raise concerns, but that is not enough. Did he call for Jimmy Lai to be released and for the end of this politically motivated trial? And yes or no answer is needed, because there's an important distinction between the two. The UK, Mr Speaker, has a historic and moral commitment to the people of Hong Kong, and we must stand up for their rights under the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights and Basic Law. This government must provide the mettle that is needed to handle this relationship. Yes, we're China, but actually stand up for the freedoms and democracy of Hong Kong and raise their game.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government absolutely agrees about the historic relationship between the UK and Hong Kong, and indeed the current relationship, which is an incredibly strong and important one. And indeed, in opposition, my party supported those measures for BNOs rightly, and we've been crystal clear in our view on yesterday's sentencing. I repeat, it was a clear demonstration of the Hong Kong authorities' use of the NSL to criminalise political dissent. I have to say, however, respectfully to the Right Honourable Lady, that when she seeks to lecture the new government in its approach to China, she should beware of what we saw over the last 14 years. Mr Speaker, a wild oscillation in policy towards China. We saw a period that went from the golden era right through finally to a complete lack of engagement, out of step with our partners like the US, indeed France and Germany, who were having those conversations, and the new government has been determined to have those conversations. She referred to the Prime Minister's meeting, where he made very clear his concerns about human rights issues. He did raise Jimmy Lai's case. That's very clear from the footage of that particular meeting. If she hasn't seen it, I would respectfully encourage her to look at it. We will continue to raise those issues of human rights as part of our consistent approach to China. Thank you.
Chair of the Select Committee, Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the verdicts and sentence of the 45 are, like the 2020 national security law itself and the treatment of Jimmy Lai, clear violations of the Sino-British Joint Declaration on Hong Kong. And following the meeting between the Presidency and the Prime Minister, would my right honourable friend please share with the House what steps the government plans to take to ensure that the joint declaration is adhered to?
Minister.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this issue and for the work that she's undertaking on this in her Select Committee leadership. The UK government has been very clear on these issues. She mentioned specifically the case of Jimmy Lai quite rightly. We see indeed British national Jimmy Lai's trial resuming tomorrow. This case is a priority for the UK government. The Foreign Secretary raised his case in his first meeting with China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi at the ASEAN Summit on the 26th of July. As I just mentioned, the Prime Minister also raised this case in his engagement a few days ago as well. We will continue to call on the Hong Kong authorities to end their politically motivated prosecution and immediately release Jimmy Lai, and we will continue to press for consular access and indeed on those other human rights issues which are of concern to all of those in this House. Thank you.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Colin Miller.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We are deeply concerned by the sentencing of the NSL 45. Beijing's assault on fundamental
Situation in Hong Kong. 45 pro-democracy campaigners have been jailed after being accused by the authorities there of trying to overthrow the government. Priti Patel there reminding the government that we have a historic and moral commitment to Hong Kong. London's South Bank was transformed into the Emerald City last night for the European premiere of Wicked. The stars dazzled on the green carpet ahead of the movie's highly anticipated release on Friday. Our entertainment reporter Debbie Regard was there and sent this report.
The dreary weather didn't rain on the parade of the cast of one of this year's most hotly anticipated film releases. You're green. I am. Wicked, the much-loved West End and Broadway show, is the latest musical to get the movie treatment. Director John M. Chu took the yellow brick road in his stride.
Well, usually I'm very stressed for the day. I'm like, oh, wow, we built this. I better shoot it well. But then the other side of me thinks about that kid who would watch Spielberg shooting Hook and be like, wow, that would be the funnest job in the world.
Wicked serves as the origin story for The Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz and is one of the highest grossing musicals of all time. But that doesn't mean everyone will be familiar with it.
I hadn't seen Wicked before, so I had no idea what it was until I read the script and I called John and said, you know it's a musical, right? I went to see it right away and I understood from not just watching the musical, but watching the audience and saw how they reacted to it, understood why it's such a legacy.
Meanwhile, Jeff Goldblum says this might just be one of his favourite films to date.
Geez, I've done a lot of movies. Tippity top. It's the maraschino cherry on top of a grand adventure.
Wicked is tipped as a big contender for the upcoming award season, but with a budget of $145 million, filmmakers will first be hoping to bewitch audiences. Debbie Ridgard, Sky News.
Now let's get a look at the weather. Well, by the end of the day, Arctic air will be established across almost the entire country, with bitterly cold, frosty nights to come and further wintry showers at times. This morning, England and Wales will be mostly cloudy, with the remnants of last night's rain, sleet and snow clearing southwards. It'll be much brighter in the north, but temperatures will struggle to rise above freezing. It's going to be milder in the southwest, but it'll be windy there as well. Showers will continue along windward coasts. Some will blow inland over Scotland, where they will fall as sleet or snow, and that should lead to some further accumulations in the north. Coastal showers will continue overnight, but it will become dry and very cold inland. Temperatures in the north may fall as low as -10 Celsius. Ice will form where there have been late showers as well. Wednesday is going to be a cold, quiet day overall, with plenty of sunshine inland, but showers around coastal areas will be wintry at times. It'll feel bitterly cold again. You're watching Sky News Today. Coming up, Russia claims Ukraine has fired US-made ATACMS missiles at the Bryansk region. We will get the very latest from Moscow. You're watching Sky News Today with me, Jane Secker. It's 1 o'clock. These are the headlines. Moscow says Ukraine has fired American long-range missiles into Russia just a day after Joe Biden gave the go-ahead. It comes as Vladimir Putin lowers the threshold for Russia's use of nuclear weapons on the 1,000th day of the war. Also ahead. Farmers take their inheritance tax protest to Westminster, calling for the scrapping of controversial changes announced in the budget. Among them, TV presenter and farmer Jeremy Clarkson, who delivered this message to the government.
Jeremy, what's your word to the government? You're live on Sky.
Please back down. Please back down.
A 92-year-old man is arrested on suspicion of the murder and rape of a woman nearly 60 years ago. Winter arrives as snow falls across the UK with a number of severe weather warnings in place. Hello, good afternoon. We begin this hour with breaking news. Russia has claimed that Ukrainian armed forces have struck a target in the Bryansk region using 6 US long-range ballistic missiles. The Russian Defence Ministry claims its air defences shot down 5 of the ATACMS missiles and damaged the other. It comes on the 1,000th day of the conflict and just hours after President Putin signed a doctrine which lowered the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. That came just a day after Joe Biden gave the Ukrainians the go-ahead to use the long-range missiles into Russian territory. In the past few minutes, the Prime Minister, who's at the G20 summit in Rio, has spoken to our political editor, Beth Rigby, and gave his reaction to today's events.
It's day 1,000 of this conflict. That's 1,000 days of Russian aggression, 1,000 days of sacrifice by Ukraine. It's impacted the rest of the world, including the United Kingdom. I've been clear throughout those 1,000 days that we must give the Ukraine the support that is needed for as long as it's needed. That's something I've doubled down on here at G20 and in recent weeks. The simplest way to end this conflict is for Russia to stop the aggression.
And the missiles are game changer.
Well, I'm not going to comment.
It's been confirmed. It's been confirmed by Russia that they have landed in their territory.
Beth, you will understand. I'm not going to comment on operational details.
In principle, are the missiles a game changer? In principle.
The reason that I'm not going to comment is, I think, well understood, which is Putin is the winner if we do so, and it will undermine Ukraine, and I'm not prepared to do that.
Just quickly, Russia's also threatened nuclear escalation. Are you comfortable with that when people at home are watching this, worrying that you could put us at risk?
Well, it's very important. It's very important that we're steadfast in our support for Ukraine. Russia is the aggressor,
even
and
if
Russia,
it unleashes nuclear war.
Russia has to be the one that makes the move to stop this war. It's within their gift, but we must support Ukraine. It's impacting not just Ukraine; it's impacting the rest of the world, including the UK.
Is your message to viewers back home that there will not be a nuclear war, because that is what Russia is threatening?
My message is that we need to ensure that Ukraine is put in the best possible position. This is 1,000 days of conflict, and there is a very high cost if Russian aggression is seen to pay off.
Well, you can see more of Beth's interview with the Prime Minister later this hour. In the meantime, let's talk to our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett. Ivor, what reaction has there been inside Russia to the use of these long-range missiles for the first time?
Yeah, so reports have first surfaced in 2 Ukrainian media outlets that Ukraine, in the early hours of this morning, launched their first strike on Russian soil with US-supplied missiles. This reportedly happened in the town of Karachev, around 70 miles from the Ukrainian border in the Russian region of Bryansk. There hasn't been any official confirmation from Ukraine yet, but Moscow says these reports are true. We've heard from the Ministry of Defence here, which issued a statement saying that a military facility was struck in the Bryansk region with 6 ballistic missiles. It says, according to their confirmed data, American-made ATACMS, which is the acronym for these US missiles, operational tactical missiles, were used. It says they shot down 5 of the missiles and damaged 1, adding that fragments fell on this technical territory of the military facility, causing a fire that it says was quickly extinguished, adding that no casualties and no damage was caused. But the big question now is, how will Russia respond to this? They have been, in the past 24, 36 hours, issuing a lot of threats and warnings of how they might react. And earlier today, we had a very clear reminder from Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin of what means Moscow has at its disposal when he formally approved the changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine that see them lower the threshold for a nuclear strike. Russia did signal back in September that it would lower this threshold and make these changes, and today we've got those formally approved. And what it means is that in theory Russia could now respond with a nuclear strike if it comes under attack from any state using conventional weapons, for example missiles, drones and aircraft. It also means that Russia could now consider any assault on Russian territory by a non-nuclear power that is supported by a nuclear power to be a joint attack, and you don't have to be a military strategist to understand that as a clear reference to Ukraine being supported by the US. So will Russia reach for the red button right now? The calculation clearly in Washington.
We're going to cross straight to the House of Commons, where the Foreign Secretary David Lammy is speaking about the 1000th day of the war.
Words, but actions. And this government has not wavered. We have stepped up support to Ukraine, we have ramped up the pressure on Russia, and we've made it clear to the world just what is at stake. In our first week in office, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, confirmed that we would provide £3 billion a year in military aid this year, next year, and every year that it's needed. This includes, my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary's announcements today, with more funding for Ukraine's Navy, more funding for drones, the extension of Op Interflex, which has trained more than 50,000 Ukrainian troops to date, and I have also increased non-military support. This financial year, we will give at least £250 million in bilateral assistance for work such as on protecting the Ukrainian power grid. We've just this weekend suffered another Russian onslaught. Mr. Speaker, crucially, our bilateral support, both militarily and non-military, will be higher this financial year than in any previous financial year since the war began. And Mr. Speaker, let me also pay tribute to the opposition for their leadership on these issues when they were in office, because the truth is this House has been able to speak on Ukraine with one voice, and long may that continue. But that is not all that we've done. We've also finding creative ways to bolster the Ukrainian economy further. We've brought the UK-Ukraine digital trade deal into force so that they benefit from cheaper and quicker trade. UK Export Finance has provided over £500 million in loan guarantees, including for Ukraine's own defence industry. British International Investment is working with the Ukrainian Bank of Reconstruction and Development to support Ukrainian trade. By the end of this year, we will have deployed a further $484 million in World Bank loan guarantees. And tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, this House will debate a bill confirming a new £2.26 billion loan to Ukraine as part of a G7 package of $50 billion. This extraordinary revenue acceleration scheme will sustain Ukraine in the fight, all paid for by the profits from frozen Russian assets. Mr. Speaker, I've made it my personal mission to do all that I can to constrain the Kremlin. Since July, we've sanctioned almost 40 vessels in Putin's shadow fleet of oil tankers, barring them from our ports and denying them access to our maritime services. We've sanctioned firms who supply Russia's military-industrial complex, including Chinese firms sending critical components such as for drones. We've sanctioned cyber criminals from the aptly named Evil Corps, Russian troops who've used chemical weapons on the battlefield, mercenaries responsible for destabilising Africa, and we've taken further action this week. Yesterday, I imposed more sanctions in response to Iran's transfer of ballistic missiles to Russia, including on Iran Air. And today, I'm announcing measures against those monsters who have forcibly deported Ukrainian children for attempted indoctrination by the Kremlin. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of all this government has done to support Ukraine, proud of the unity that this House has shown on this issue, proud that we have proven Britain will remain Ukraine's staunchest friend, throughout this war and in the peace that follows. But we are always stronger when we work with others. So I'm also proud of what we've done to rally international support to Ukraine. I visited Ukraine with US Secretary of State Tony Blinken, the first such joint visit to any country for over a decade. I discussed Ukraine with the EU Foreign Affairs Council, the first appearance by a Foreign Secretary at a regular Council meeting since our EU exit. And yesterday, I chaired a meeting of the United Nations Security Council on Ukraine. And just this morning, I joined a meeting of close European allies to discuss how we bolster our support for Ukraine over the coming months. In all our discussions with allies and partners across the globe, we are stressing three fundamental truths about this war. First, Ukraine's cause is a just one. It is Putin who chose to invade a sovereign country which posed no threat to Russia. Putin who disregarded the UN Charter. Putin who's trying to turn back the clock to an age of empire building when might made right and ordinary people must suffer the consequences. And it's Putin and his allies who are recklessly escalating this war with Iranian ballistic missiles used to strike Ukrainian cities and North Korean troops sent to attack Ukrainian soldiers. So when we support Ukraine, we're not just aiding the fight for their freedom, we're also contributing to our fight for our freedom, the freedom of all states all over the world to choose their own destiny and future. The second truth, Putin's war is not in fact going that well. Russia is almost 1,000 days into a war it thought it would end in days, and we should never forget that. Russia has suffered record numbers of casualties in the past 2 months, with numbers killed or injured due to exceed 1 million next year. Russia is slashing welfare payments and raising interest rates to levels not seen in decades, all to fund more arms. And Russia has had to turn to Tehran. It's had to turn to Pyongyang as reserves of Soviet-era equipment and targets for Kremlin press gangs run low. This is not sustainable. The war is costing Putin dearly, all in a fight for land to which Russia has absolutely no right, and for which the Russian people are paying an enormous price. And the final truth, Mr. Speaker, Putin has no interest in a just peace. It is 1,000 days since his full-scale invasion, but over 10 years since he first seized Crimea and sponsored insurrection in the Donbass, and even longer that he has sought to meddle in Ukrainian affairs, all to further his own interests. Putin has a track record of violating past agreements. He shows no sign of wanting peace. He would seek to exploit any pause in fighting to win his troops a respite before resuming hostilities, as he did after the failed Minsk talks. Mr. Speaker, we underlie these truths because they must inform our strategy. If we want to see peace restored in Europe, we need Putin to see there's no route to military victory. We need to make the price he pays for his senseless war even higher. We need to remember the price we would pay for his victory would be higher still. We need Ukraine to stay strong, and so they need us to stay strong by their side. That is what this House wants us to do. That is what this government will do. That is what we call on our allies to do. Slava Ukraini. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement, and importantly to the government for making time to acknowledge and mark this absolutely tragic and terrible anniversary. I, like so many in this House, remember the early morning of that dark day in February in 2022, 1,000 days ago. As Home Secretary at the time, I recall that early morning call, being notified of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. It was a day we had all feared, having seen Russian troops gather close to the border in several weeks beforehand, and over the previous decade since the invasion of Crimea and Russian support for the separatists in Donbass. The sovereign territory of a European nation had been violated, and as the Foreign Secretary has said, we've all watched the horrors unfold over the last 1,000 days, but we saw them very specifically in those early days as a Russian military machine advanced deeper into Ukrainian territory. I pay tribute to the heroism, the courage and the bravery of Ukrainian armed forces, and also to the people who have proudly defended their sovereign territory. Let us be in no doubt, Putin expected Ukraine to capitulate and for their government to fall. He thought that he could be an aggressive bully and bully his way into that territory. But the bravery of President Zelensky, and with that bravery, they all stood tall. They fought on, and they are fighting every day, and at the cost of Russia, and to Russia, it has been catastrophic. They're not just fighting for their country, they're fighting, Mr. Speaker, for their freedoms and our shared values of freedom, democracy, sovereignty and fundamental rights. And throughout that time, and before Russian troops crossed the border, I think we should be proud that this Parliament has stood shoulder to shoulder with our Ukrainian friends. And Mr. Speaker, you will also recall that in 2022, the entire government machinery mobilised to support Ukraine, and that cross-party support has to this day been pivotal. Right from the start of creating safer routes that enabled 20,000 plus Ukrainians to come to our country, from the work of the Ministry of Defence under Ben Wallace at the time, to being one of the first countries to provide and supply weapons and key capabilities to train Ukrainian troops in our own country, and to sign that security cooperation agreement that the Foreign Secretary has mentioned, to announce the multi-million and multi-billion funding package as well. And the then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, flew the flag for Ukraine across the world, making that case, and also imposing sanctions on Russia, persuading others of their commitment to Ukraine and fighting that cause for freedom. We stand shoulder to shoulder with the government in every single effort, and the commitments have been solid, along with working with all our partners in that absolutely unstinting way. And Mr. Speaker, I also saw that devastation when I met Ukrainians on the Polish border fleeing the conflict. And I know so many members of this House have visited Ukraine and met families over the last 1,000 days. We've all been touched by those personal horror stories, the loss, the grief from people and children whose lives have been shattered, and our thoughts are with them. It's a sobering and stark reminder that while the modern world has delivered so much progress for humankind, and there are unreconstructed tyrants that are inflicting misery beyond comprehension with their contempt for human dignity, democracy and the rule of law. And we saw that so clearly over the weekend with those devastating waves of attacks that were unleashed by Putin. I do have a few questions for the Foreign Secretary off the back of his statement. On military support, will the Secretary of State confirm that we will continue to provide all the resources we can from our own stocks and work with our allies in NATO to ensure equivalent equipment is available for Ukraine if we do not progress with specific capabilities ourselves? NATO countries, as we know, are able to leverage a collective GDP 20 times greater than Russia and a combined defence inventory many times larger than the Kremlin's. So there is nothing inevitable about Russia's victory in this war, and I know the Defence Secretary is on the front bench today as well, and he'll have views on that. But I think we'd welcome some indication as to what steps the government will take to replenish our stocks. And does the Foreign Secretary, on behalf of the government, agrees that this shows why it's important that we have a clear pathway to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2030? And beyond the provision of lethal aid and capability, can the Foreign Secretary give updates on his diplomatic activity and actions to further isolate Russia and address this influx of troops from North Korea? Exactly. On sanctions, we absolutely welcomed the announcements this week on those sanctions on Iran for supporting the Russian war effort, and we must pursue those with vigour. Also, with this, can we seek assurances that the government will continue to review the measures when it comes to people and entities within the scope of sanctions, so that we can absolutely do more to prosecute Russia's role in this conflict? And can the Foreign Secretary outline the approach that will be taken to engaging with the new US administration more widely with our allies to back Ukraine? It's vital that this House stands united, Mr. Speaker, and as we mark the 1,000 days of this war, we must ensure we continue to stand shoulder to shoulder on the side of freedom. Slava Ukraini.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is my first opportunity to...
Well, that there, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy announcing that the UK is expanding military support for Ukraine with funding to provide new drone capabilities, and also confirming that a number of Ukrainian armed forces recruits trained by the UK on British soil has passed 50,000 now. That is their Operation Interflex, which has been delivered since the summer of 2022 and is now supported by 12 other countries. Also confirming UK government spending on military support for Ukraine is now at its highest ever level since the start of the full-scale invasion. £3 billion spent this year. Well, let's talk to our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, now, who joins us from the G20. Deborah, good to talk to you. The government very much taking the opportunity of this 1,000th day marker to restate their support, both in real financial terms and in psychological terms for Ukraine.
Yes, the Foreign Secretary really wanting to drive home that point that Vladimir Putin had hoped to be able to capture his neighbour within just a few days, and yet 1,000 days later, this full-scale invasion is still underway. But it is a bit of an alternate reality, frankly, that the Foreign Secretary is trying to paint when he talks about how the war isn't going very well for Russia. Of course, Russia has absorbed horrendous numbers of casualties. The casualty rate for its troops in the last month is over 1,500 soldiers a day killed and injured. That's a level of attrition that, for example, the British Army could not withhold for barely a few days, let alone 1,000 days. Actually, fixating on the numbers of Russian dead and injured doesn't reflect the reality on the ground, which is that Russian troops are still advancing in the east. They are pushing back now as well in the west of their country, where Ukrainian forces, you'll remember over the summer, invaded and captured territory. They've also now got North Korean troops on the ground. And we're just hearing these reports from Russian state media about the use by Ukraine for the first time of these American-supplied ATACMS Army Tactical Missile System ballistic missiles. The Russians saying that 6 were fired, 5 were shot down. We don't have that confirmed from the Ukrainian side, but it ratchets up the tensions at a time when Vladimir Putin, most likely very deliberately, has chosen to confirm this reduction in the threshold that Russia would look to when it seeks to retaliate to an attack with nuclear weapons.
Deborah, thanks very much. Well, let's get more on this with our defence and security analyst, Professor Michael Clark, who joins me here in the studio. Michael, first of all, these long-range missiles that are reported to have been used overnight, will they change anything in the course of the war?
No, they might change things in the Kursk region, which is where they seem to be used at the moment. The Russians are reporting that this first salvo of ATACMS that they're admitting to, that the Ukrainians say they've fired, was at Karachev. And Karachev is in the Bryansk region, and that's about 200 kilometres away, so about 120 miles. That's well within the range of ATACMS missiles. So it looks as if the Ukrainians have fired some ATACMS missiles at this logistics support hub, the 1046 logistics support hub, which is obviously going for ammunition. That's where they store it, and there's some reports of some quite big explosions there. The Russians are saying they shot down 5 of these 6 ATACMS. I think they'd be going very well if they shot down 5. I'd be amazed if they had. But they might have got one of them, perhaps. But undoubtedly, the Ukrainians have done some damage at Karachev, and this will be the forerunner of more that they will try to do to reduce the supply of material into the Kursk region. They'll also, I think, if I was them, I'd be trying to use them against the support to the North Koreans. They'll want to undermine the North Korean presence there as much as they can. And if they can't target the North Koreans themselves, I'm sure they'll try to target their supply bases and their support lines as much as they can. Make it as hard as they possibly can for the North Koreans to have to function, make it really uncomfortable for them if they can. So we'll see. But I imagine the Ukrainians will now start firing off a lot of Atacam missiles in the next few days and weeks.
And no announcement from David Lammy about the Storm Shadow missiles, which are sort of the UK equivalent, and whether or not Ukraine's...
Yeah, I was just looking through the statement, as you were, and I can't see anything about Storm Shadow here. I mean, he's confirming that we're spending about $3 billion a year. We're giving, in military aid, about $3 billion's worth a year, and we're going to continue to do that, which is... It's not negligible, but it won't make a huge difference. And we're helping to train troops in Operation Interflex, 50,000 Ukrainian troops trained so far. So they're training about 25 or 30,000 a year, and we can probably increase that. But Storm Shadow is something, the use of Storm Shadow is something the Ukrainians really want. And the UK government wants them to be able to use it. And it's not entirely clear what the problem is, whether it's a technical issue, that it has American components in it and therefore needs American permission, or whether they could be used, but they wouldn't have American help in targeting. Both of those rationales have been used. And also just the alliance rationale that we want all the allies to line up behind us if we give this permission. So I think it will come. I thought it would come before now, to be honest, but it hasn't so far. And we seem to be getting ourselves into a bit of a tangle about the use of Storm Shadow. But if the Ukrainians could use it, they certainly will, and they'll use it in the same sort of way that they're now using Atacams. And I think they'll probably use Storm Shadow as well, more intensively, inside occupied Ukraine, because they're able to go for Russian forces that are still in Ukrainian territory.
OK, Michael, thanks very much. Now, the first consultant to raise concerns with hospital managers about Lucy Letby has apologised to the families who lost their children. Dr Stephen Brearley is the latest person to speak at the Thirlwall Inquiry, which is looking into how the former nurse was able to murder babies at the Countess of Chester Hospital, as well as the conduct of staff and the wider culture at the NHS. Let's talk to our Chief North of England correspondent, Greg Milam, who is in Liverpool for us. Greg, just talk us through what the inquiry's been hearing today.
Yeah, Stephen Brearley was the lead clinician in the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital at the time that Lucy Letby was carrying out her crimes. And last year he accused executives at the hospital of not taking seriously what he and other doctors were telling them about Lucy Letby, the concerns they had, concerns he said that were raised on multiple occasions. Today he was asked about a meeting that he attended after the first 3 babies died, and when it was pointed out to him that Lucy Letby had been present on all of those occasions. And he said in that meeting, "Oh no, not Lucy, not nice Lucy." And he was asked about why he said that. He said it was a spontaneous response on the fact there was a suspicion, a concern that maybe a nurse might be involved. He said he wasn't concerned that one nurse might have been present at 3 occasions just because of staffing. He said he believed it was good, they were good people who were working in the unit. But as more deaths occurred with Lucy Letby present, he said that should have triggered closer inspection of those incidents so that action could have been taken. He said the NHS is not good at picking out bad apples when it carries out reviews like this. And before he gave his evidence today, he said he wanted to speak directly to the families involved, the families of those babies who died, those who were harmed. And this is what he said when he did that.
Sorry. Sorry for my part in not being able to protect your babies. I can just say that I tried my best, and I acknowledge that at times my best was not enough. This apologies to the parents in the indictment, but also parents who are involved in the ongoing police investigation. I hope that you all get the truth and justice that you deserve.
So that apology there from Stephen Brearley. He was also asked about a meeting that he said to have had with the Director of Nursing that the inquiry heard about last month, where he said to have pointed to what he called a drawer of doom, records about what had happened and some of Lucy Letby's cases. He said he had no recollection of that meeting, and he said calling it a drawer of doom was belittling to those concerns that the doctors had. It was put to him today, though, that it had taken far too long to detect what was going on with Lucy Letby in the neonatal unit. He said yes, and that's why we're here to work that out.
Greg, thank you. Now to a major police breakthrough in a cold case murder. A 92-year-old man has been arrested on suspicion of murder and rape in relation to the death of a woman nearly 60 years ago. Louisa Dunn was found at her home in Bristol dead in 1967. Our correspondent Alice Porter is here with more. And Alice, tell us about this lady, what happened to her and how this development has now come to this.
Well, this murder case has been unsolved for almost 60 years, but now officers who are reinvestigating the case have had this significant breakthrough, and they have had an arrest that happened this morning. This is a 92-year-old man from the Ipswich area of Suffolk. He was arrested by officers from Avon and Somerset Police on suspicion of murder and rape. Now, he's been taken into custody for questioning. And this arrest comes, why this has happened now, after a significant development in the investigation, because the case was reviewed last year. And this review included further forensic examination of key items relating to the case. Now, in terms of who Louisa Dunn was, she was 75 when she was found dead in her home in North East Bristol. She was found by her neighbour on the 28th of June 1967. Now, the cause of her death was strangulation and asphyxiation. She had also been raped. So this has really shocked so many in the community in Bristol. And up until now, no one has been arrested. Now, Avon and Somerset Police say the next of kin for Louisa Dunn have been identified and they're in communication with them. But they also say that there will be increased police activity in the Ipswich area as a result of a 92-year-old man being arrested on suspicion of murder and rape.
Alice, thanks very much. Right, let's just bring you a little bit more we have from the farming protest down in central London today. Jeremy Clarkson has been down there, got quite a warm reception from the gathered farmers. Also managed to grab a chat with our SJ a short while ago, and just to warn you that there is some flash photography coming up as well.
Jeremy, Sarah Jake from Sky News. What do you want to say to the government about what's happening to farmers with the inheritance tax?
Back down.
Keep moving, please,
Back
guys,
down.
keep moving.
You know, if you make a mistake, we all do, and they have, be big enough to say, we made a mistake here, and then back down.
What happens if they don't?
I don't know. British aren't very good at protesting.
Keep moving, please, guys. What do you want to say to the farmers here today?
Well, good luck. You know, I'm trying to support you as best I can.
Do you agree with the government trying to close the tax loophole, though, for wealthy people buying up land, pricing farmers out?
No, that's not the argument. That's not the argument.
Do you think the government are listening,
It's
Jeremy?
not that they're pricing farmers out. That's not the argument.
Do you think the government are listening?
No, he's in Rio. You'd have to have big ears to hear us from there.
Do you think this will change the government's mind?
I don't know. Hope so.
On this side, go on this side.
I'm going to get in there.
Yeah. Jeremy, what could you do best to help farmers? I know you've turned up here today. We continue this fight with them because you are part of the farming community now.
No, no,
and they look to you.
I'm just a journalist who has a farm and is able to report through the vehicle of Clarkson's farm what it's like to be a farmer.
And just how hard is that?
You've no idea. Have you seen Clarkson's farm?
I have,
It's
yes.
that hard.
And I spoke to a gentleman who lost his father, and he thinks it's because of this kind of pressure. And you've spoken
I wouldn't be
about the
surprised. The
mental health
suicide rate in farming is off the charts. Because there's just very little support. And do forgive me, I've got to go.
Just a final message for the Prime Minister, if he's watching today from Rio.
He isn't. He's in Rio.
If he's watching,
He's watching. He's going la 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 la. Sit with adenoids. La 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 with his Playmobil hair. Don't like him.
Okay, Jeremy, thank you.
Well, Jeremy Clarkson there ending that interview in his inimitable style. But he did reference suicide there and suicide rates in farming. If you've been affected by what they were discussing, help is, of course, always available from the Samaritans 24 hours a day. You can call 116 123 or email joe@samaritans.org. We will have much more from that protest in Whitehall on the UK tonight at 8 o'clock with Sarah Jane, talking to the organisers and the farmers affected, as well as Jeremy Clarkson. That's on at 8 o'clock tonight. You're watching Sky News today. Coming up, over 2,000 children have been killed or injured since the escalation of the war in Ukraine 1,000 days ago. We're going to be joined by UNICEF on Ukraine next. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's in Rio for the final day of the G20 summit. Our political editor Beth Rigby sat down with him a short while ago, started by discussing the war in Ukraine and Russia's claims that Ukrainian forces have struck inside Russia using 6 US long-range ballistic missiles.
Prime Minister, the Ukraine-Russia war has been raging for 1,000 days. Ukraine wants to end the war. Russia confirms 6 long-range US missiles have now been fired into their territory. Is this a game changer? And have you discussed ending this war with Donald Trump?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's day 1,000 of this conflict. That's 1,000 days of Russian aggression, 1,000 days of sacrifice by Ukraine. It's impacted the rest of the world, including the United Kingdom. I've been clear throughout those 1,000 days that we must give the Ukraine the support that is needed for as long as it's needed. That's something I've doubled down on here at G20 and in recent weeks. The simplest way to end this conflict is for Russia to stop the aggression.
And the missiles are a game changer.
Well, I'm not going to comment.
It's been confirmed. It's been confirmed by Russia that they have landed in their territory.
Beth, you will understand. I'm not going to comment on operational details.
In principle, are the missiles a game changer? In principle.
The reason that I'm not going to comment is, I think, well understood, which is Putin is the winner if we do so, and it will undermine Ukraine, and I'm not prepared to do that.
Just quickly, Russia's also threatened nuclear escalation. Are you comfortable with that when people at home are watching this, worrying that you could put us at risk?
Well, it's very important. It's very important that we're steadfast in our support for Ukraine. Russia is the aggressor,
even
and
if
Russia,
it unleashes nuclear war.
Russia has to be the one that makes the move to stop this war. It's within their gift, but we must support Ukraine. It's impacting not just Ukraine; it's impacting the rest of the world, including the UK.
Is your message to viewers back home that there will not be a nuclear war, because that is what Russia is threatening?
My message is that we need to ensure that Ukraine is put in the best possible position. This is 1,000 days of conflict, and there is a very high cost if Russian aggression is seen to pay off, a cost that we will all pay, because this is not just about sovereignty in Ukraine. It's about our freedoms, it's about our way of life, and it impacts everybody across the United Kingdom.
Prime Minister,
we are working, of course, with allies to make sure Ukraine is in the best possible position.
Prime Minister, your budget's backfiring back home. Over 15,000 farmers descending on London angry at inheritance tax changes. You insist the tax only hits landowning couples once the 3 million threshold is hit. You think wealthy landowners need to pay more tax?
Well, I want to support farming. It's very important that we do so, and that's why in the budget we put down £5 billion over the next 2 years into farming, into food sustainability. That's the biggest sum of money that's ever been put into farming.
Landowners should pay more tax?
So far as inheritance tax is concerned, in a typical case, as you rightly say,
I've said 3 million
which is
quid.
a family wanting to pass on to one of their children, so a classic case, that's a £3 million
But you think
threshold.
wealthy landowners should pay more tax?
Meeting the concern of the farmers, what I would say, and this is important, the vast majority, therefore, will be unaffected by this. Where people are over that threshold, that's a small number of cases, the tax is 20%, so half of what everybody else pays, and it's payable over 10 years. But I would also just add this, which is...
Do you think they should pay more tax?
Let me just add this, because I do think it's important. I grew up, obviously, in a rural area, and I know that in rural areas, in farming communities, they need good hospitals, they need good schools, and they need houses that people can afford. And that's what we invest in the budget.
So you think wealthy landowners need to pay more for public services? That's where you're at?
Well, over the £3 million threshold, then that's where we've said the balance is right to start paying at that lower rate of 20%.
In your tax decisions, you've targeted people who send their kids to private schools, people who earn income from assets, landowners, small business owners. There's a pattern here. Is it a class war for you?
No, absolutely not.
It's not a class war?
No, it's not. And let me just take one of those examples, which is the VAT on private schools. I do know that people watching this will save hard to send their child to a private school because they think that's the best thing for their child. But every single parent wants opportunity and aspiration for their child. And up until now, we haven't had the right number of teachers in basic subjects like maths, etc., in our state secondary schools. I'm not prepared to tolerate that for our state schools.
What's your message to wealthy people who thinks you are waging a class war against them? What's your message to them? Because that's how some people feel.
it isn't at all what we're doing. It's a balanced approach. We had to fill a black hole which was left by the last government. We had to make sure we stabilised our economy. And we've invested, and I think the vast majority of people know that we had to invest in our NHS, which was broken, in our schools to make sure every single child can go as far as their talent will take them, and in housing so that people can have a safe and secure roof over their head that they can afford, a sort of base camp for their dreams.
You've repeatedly said raising economic growth is your #1 priority, yet in the first 3 months of your government, the economy's barely grown and it actually contracted in September. You must be pretty gutted by that.
Well, I want those figures to improve.
They're not good enough,
they're
are they?
not good enough, and I want them to improve. I think the best way of turbocharging that is to get the inward investment into our country. And I'm really pleased that our investment summit brought in £63 billion. That's measured in jobs in different parts of the country. But do we want that to improve? Do I want those figures to improve? Yes, of course I do.
OK, Prime Minister, just quickly, in 2015 you supported the Assist in Dying bill. Do you feel torn on it now?
Look, I do know that there are very strong feelings on this, which is why I've been clear it's a free vote and MPs must decide for themselves. I prosecuted and looked at every single case over 5 years, every investigation. I know it's deeply held, and this is not a party political issue. MPs will have to decide for themselves.
Your Health Secretary ordered a review into the potential implications for NHS services. This isn't about money, though, is it? It's not about money, this decision, is it?
This is about a deeply held belief on sort of both sides of the argument, if you like. When I was Chief Prosecutor, we did the biggest consultation ever in criminal justice, and I saw for myself how important it is.
So why is your Health Secretary turning it into an argument about money, and should he be doing that?
Look, I don't think pressure should be put on MPs about how they vote.
So you don't think he should have done that?
I think we need to stay neutral. I'm not going to talk about individual members of the Cabinet.
Have you spoken to him about it?
I've spoken to all of the Cabinet all of the time.
Including West Streeting?
I talk to the Cabinet all of the time, as you'd expect. But the most important thing is when that vote comes up, MPs know that it's a free vote, it's not party political, and I will respect whatever way people vote because I do understand just how deeply felt it is.
OK, Prime Minister, last question. You're 4 months into your premiership. You want to make a lasting mark. When you think of consequential Prime Ministers, you've got Attlee, who was the welfare state, Thatcher, who was all about enterprise, Blair, who was about modernisation. What's the essence of you in one word?
I want working people to be better off. I want people to feel the impact of our policies in their pocket so that they can enjoy life in the way that they want to with themselves and their family. The basic securities that working people want. A decent wage that provides for them and their family. Education that allows their children to go as far as their talent will take them. A health service that's there when they need it. But in a nutshell, it's about making working people feel better off. And I'm determined that that will remain my focus.
A working people warrior?
Yes, I want working people to be better off, and I make no apologies for that.
Well, let's talk to our political editor, Beth Rigby, now. And Beth, just rewinding back to the beginning of your conversation on Ukraine, clear that the government wants to send out this message on the 1000th day, that they are still standing full square behind Ukraine.
Absolutely, Jane, but what was interesting was the Prime Minister just simply would not discuss nor confirm about those long-range missiles. Russia saying, just before we interviewed him, saying that some of those US long-range cruise missiles had been fired into their territory, half a dozen of them. I asked him about it. He said, I simply won't discuss operational matters. That's the line he has kept, but also questions, of course, about whether the UK Storm Shadow missiles are going to be used. And then the subsequent question about the nuclear threat, because Russia actively talking about that today. He said it's important we're steadfast in our support for Ukraine. Russia's the aggressor. Russia has to be the one that makes the move to stop the war. So the Prime Minister there full square behind Ukraine. But of course, Trump is on the horizon. He says he wants peace. And I guess the question really is, what sort of escalation do we see in the next 2 months of Western support to try and put Zelensky in the strongest position he can be as Trump enters the White House?
Meanwhile, Beth, back here at home, of course, we've had this big protest from farmers. Jeremy Clarkson, talking on Sky News just a short while ago, says the Prime Minister isn't listening. He's over there in Rio, and even if he wasn't, he'd have his fingers in his ears saying la, la, la. It's a difficult situation for the Prime Minister domestically at the moment, isn't it?
It is a difficult situation. Look, first off, Jane, when I asked him about the economic growth, the anaemic figures for the third quarter, that's the period of July to September, they're just really sluggish. And the economy actually contracted in September. I asked him about that, and he did. He fessed up. He said, it's not good enough. So that's the framing of it, that growth isn't good enough. It's what his whole missions are around getting that economic growth. And then on the issues of the farmers, there is a massive backlash here, and he is standing firm. But you saw in those questions that I put to him about where he is targeting these tax rises and the backlash that has been felt. And I asked him, is this a class war? Because some people do see it like that. You're taxing landowners. He's talking about how it's only on estates over 3 million, but targeting parents that send their kids to private school. And I put that to him, and he said simply, I am not waging a class war. He said, look, wealthier people, wealthy landowners, they need to put more money into better public services. And I think you're going to hear that on rinse and repeat in the coming days as he tries to justify the decision to tax farmers more on inheritance tax. But it is deeply unpopular. And then at the end, when I said to him, well, look, in essence, what's your government about? Lots of us are asking that, like, what is driving him? He said it's about working people being better off. When I said to him, are you a working people warrior? He said yes. And I think that that is really the discussion here about how he gets that economic growth, who he chooses to tax, and the kind of way in which that lands across a country where millions of voters gave him the benefit of the doubt. Lots of voters in rural communities. And now they are seeing these tax rises that perhaps were not flagged in the run-up to the election. But he is holding firm, and the gamble is that those better public services will encourage people to give his government another chance as he nears the next election.
Beth, thanks very much. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, in Rio de Janeiro at the G20. Well, let's return to what's happening in Eastern Europe now. And as we've been saying, today is 1,000 days since Russia invaded Ukraine. Over 2,400 children have been killed or injured since the escalation of the war on the 24th of February 2022. That's roughly 16 children a day. Toby Fricker is the Chief of Communications and Advocacy at UNICEF Ukraine. He's in Kharkiv and joins me now. Tony, good to talk to you today. So children, then, the real losers in this conflict, as in so many conflicts around the world.
Yeah, that's right. They are. I mean, children are impacted every day in the hostilities in Ukraine and in other crises around the world. And that's children who are being killed and maimed every day. That's children who are being displaced. In Ukraine now, there's more than 3.7 million people displaced across the country. It's children who have had to move abroad for safety, living now as refugees. And I mean, the war in Ukraine has an impact on every part of childhood. And that's why it's absolutely critical that we step up that protection for children, but also keep providing the services that we can to better protect children and to invest in their futures. Just yesterday, we were at a metro station in Kharkiv, where there's a school. The schools are set up in metro stations to keep children safe. There's children there laughing, having fun, speaking to the teachers, engaging with their friends. But it's not normal. They're in a metro station to stay safe. And it's absolutely vital that we do whatever we can as UNICEF, but also as multiple partners here in Ukraine, to provide some sense of normality for children.
And what are the challenges of getting in and getting that help to the children there?
Well, I mean, there are immense challenges around on the frontline areas. Of course, the fighting is extremely heavy. You have families who don't want to leave their homes. Of course, no one wants to leave their homes, and sometimes that's left very late. UNICEF's been providing, for example, emergency access to water supplies to keep the systems running as best we can, working with local authorities. When there are attacks that hit water pumping stations, for example, how can we then provide that emergency access to water for families who are still in the area? But it's also about supporting those on the move, as we say, so children, families in internally displaced centres. We were in a centre the other day on the outskirts of Kharkiv, where we met children and their families. They were having some sort of structured art activities, art therapy, just to help these young children to have that, like I said, that sort of normality that is not there as part of war. So it's trying to really provide that support now. to reduce the longer term impact that would have psychologically and on their well-being as a whole.
And those long-term psychological impacts are very, very difficult to address, aren't they? And how many children do you think are going to be affected forever by what they've experienced when they were very little?
Yeah, I mean, as we know, the generational impact of trauma can be massive, on children immediately, but on their physical and mental health further down the line. Data shows around 1.5 million children in Ukraine showing some form of mental health conditions. And that could be increased anxiety, it could be difficulty to sleep, and many other symptoms that play out over time. So the importance is getting sort of that psychological first aid as quickly as possible. So we actually met a Red Cross mobile team in the Saltivka neighborhood of Kharkiv, which is in the northern part, where there have been attacks, sort of a very heavy attack recently, where a couple of children were also reportedly killed. And what they do is really provide that psychological support immediately, as quickly as they can, to families, to help them through that immediate shock of what they've lived through. But it's also then about that longer term support. And that's also where education comes in. So we're getting children back into some form of schooling when it's safe to do so. And it's also about building the social workforce in Ukraine when so many people have also left. It's working with people, skilling people to become social workers. And we have a training center, for example, in Dnipro in the east, where we're working with a lot of women, but also younger men, to try and help them to move into the social workforce where they can, to provide support for children today, but also in the future, building that capacity over the longer run.
And you talked about the children that have been displaced. And of course, for them, they may have avoided the trauma of the conflict because their families have shipped them out. But just that very act of being displaced and starting a new life when you're very young somewhere else, that can be enormously traumatic too, can't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone who moves home, even in peacetime, they say moving home is one of the most stressful things at any time. And yet alone when you're forced to move home because it's just too dangerous to stay. Again, I met another family in the East recently there was a 14-year-old girl, Dasha, and again, the mum said, we tried to stay. My parents didn't want to leave. Dasha, she was doing schooling online, but she hasn't been to school for 3 years. But it got to a point where they just couldn't stay anymore. It was far too dangerous. So they're on the move. They're moving west to where it's a little bit safer for them. But that has a huge impact. You're leaving friends. You're trying to reconnect with new friends. You're going to a new, hopefully in person, to a new school to try and sort of build a new life for now. And they don't know what will happen to their home. Will they ever see that home again? And I think that has a massive impact on communities, of course. And it's about what we're trying to do also is this sort of what we call social cohesion. So working with families, across Europe as well, but also inside Ukraine when they're in new areas, to bring young people together through youth centers. They're playing music together. We were with some kids the other day in the north. And just bringing the community together, bringing children together and young people to connect and to be with friends, build new friendships and build a new community where they can. But the stress is there. It's a massive impact on everyday childhood.
Yeah, Toby Fricker from UNICEF. Really good to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us on the 1,000th day, or marking the 1,000th day of the war in Ukraine. Thank you. Let's bring you some of the day's other news now. And the eldest son of Norway's crown prince has been arrested on suspicion of rape, Norwegian police say. Marius Borg Høiby is the stepson of the heir to the Norwegian throne, but has no royal title or official duties. Norwegian media say that he denies the accusation. Zoe Ball has announced she's stepping back from her Radio 2 breakfast show after 6 years to focus on her family. The TV presenter took over the morning programme in 2019 from Chris Evans. She'll host her last show on the 20th of December. Scott Mills will replace her in early January. We've been showing you lots of images of the bad weather. Well, look at this. A bus has crashed into the side of a house in South Yorkshire amid heavy snowfall in the area overnight. Yellow weather warnings are still currently in place for Northern England, as well as the Midlands, Northern Scotland and a large part of Northern Ireland. Let's bring you that weather in more detail. Well, the rain, sleet and snow are clearing southwards today. It's going to leave the entire country with an Arctic air mass, with daytime temperatures struggling to rise much above freezing. This afternoon, the milder air is still hanging on in the south, but skies will clear from the north. As well as the low temperatures, there'll be significant wind chill along North Sea coasts. Northern parts of the country will see some good sunny spells inland. Showers, though, continuing around windward coasts. Over Scotland, these will fall as sleet or snow. You're watching Sky News Today. Coming up next with Kamali, we'll have more on the developing story that Russia claims that Ukrainian armed forces have struck a target inside Russia using US long-range ballistic missiles.
Good afternoon, it is 2 o'clock. This is Sky News Today, your headlines. Russia says Ukraine has fired American long-range missiles into Russia just a day after President Joe Biden gave the go-ahead. It comes as President Vladimir Putin lowers the threshold for Russia's use of nuclear weapons on the day the war hits yet another milestone.
Day 1,000 of this conflict, that's 1,000 days of Russian aggression, 1,000 days of sacrifice by Ukraine. It's impacted the rest of the world, including the United Kingdom.
Also ahead, farmers take their protests against inheritance tax to Westminster, calling for the scrapping of the controversial change which was announced in the budget. Among them, the television presenter and farmer, Jeremy Clarkson, who delivered this message to the government.
Back down.
Keep moving, please.
Back down.
Keep moving.
You know, if you make a mistake, we all do, and they have, be big enough to say, we made a mistake here.
Plus, a 92-year-old man is arrested on suspicion of the murder and rape of a woman nearly 60 years ago. Winter arrives as snow falls across the UK with a number of severe weather warnings in place. Thanks for being with us. Now, Russia has claimed that Ukraine has used 6 US-supplied long-range ballistic missiles to attack a target in Bryansk. The Russian Defense Ministry says its air defences shot down 5 of the ATACMS and damaged the other. It comes on the 1,000th day of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and just hours after President Putin signed a doctrine which lowered the threshold for that country's use of nuclear weapons. Well, yesterday, President Joe Biden gave the Ukrainians the go-ahead to use those long-range missiles to hit sites in Russia. Well, earlier, the Prime Minister, who's at the G20 in Rio, spoke to our political editor, Beth Rigby.
It's day 1,000 of this conflict. That's 1,000 days of Russian aggression, 1,000 days of sacrifice by Ukraine. It's impacted the rest of the world, including the United Kingdom. I've been clear throughout those 1,000 days that we must give the Ukraine the support that is needed for as long as it's needed. That's something I've doubled down on here at G20 and in recent weeks. The simplest way to end this conflict is for Russia to stop the...
And the missiles are game changer.
Well, I'm not going to...
It's been confirmed. It's been confirmed by Russia that they have landed in their territory.
Beth, you will understand. I'm not going to comment on operational details.
I'll tell you, no, but a game changer.
The reason that I'm not going to comment is, I think, well understood, which is Putin is the winner if we do so, and it will undermine Ukraine, and I'm not prepared to do that.
Now, in a moment, we're going to speak to our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who's at the G20. But first, let's go to Moscow and bring in our correspondent there, Ivor Bennett. Ivor, great to have you with us. So, look, the Russians have said that these 6 ATACMS have been fired into Bryansk. What is the Ministry of Defence there saying about that incident?
Well, the reports first came from 2 Ukrainian media outlets, actually, that in the early hours of this morning, Kyiv carried out its first strike on Russian territory, on Russian soil, with US-supplied missiles. The attack reportedly came in the Russian town of Karachev in the Bryansk region, which borders Ukraine. It's 70 miles, the town is, from the Ukrainian border. There's been no official confirmation from Kyiv yet, but we have heard from Moscow and Russia's Ministry of Defence that said these reports are true. They've issued a statement confirming that a military facility was struck in the Bryansk region with 6 ballistic missiles. And according to their data, they say American-made ATACMS, to use the missiles acronym, were used. It goes on to say it shot down 5 of these missiles and damaged one of them. Debris fell on the facility, causing a fire that it says was quickly extinguished, adding that no casualties or damage was caused. We've also just heard from Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who's been speaking at the G20 summit in Rio, where he has echoed the lines we've heard from the Kremlin in the last 24 hours, saying that this is a signal the West wants escalation and that Russia will react accordingly. Have a listen.
Well, on the decision of the United States to allow Ukrainian regime to use missiles up to 300 kilometers long, we read what the New York Times published about this. There are still no confirmation either from the White House or from the Pentagon, but we basically take our position on the basis of what is going on physically. And physically, ATACMS, apparently not as long as 300 kilometers, are being used, including this early morning in Russia, against the Bryansk Oblast of Russia, which is bordering Ukraine. And we proceed from the understanding that this is happening, and that any modification of ATACMS cannot be used without American experts and instructors, including satellite data, including programming and targeting. The President mentioned this several times. If long-range missiles are going to be applied from Ukraine into Russian territory, it will also mean that they are operated by American experts, military experts. And we will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia, and we'll react accordingly.
So the big question now is, how will Russia respond? Well, the Kremlin gave a very clear signal of the means at its disposal earlier today when Vladimir Putin approved changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine, which sets out when and how Russia can use a nuclear strike, and the changes essentially lower the threshold for Russia to use nuclear weapons. From now on, they can respond with nuclear weapons if Russia is attacked by any state using conventional weapons, including drones, including aircraft, including missiles. So is Russia actually going to respond now with nukes? Will they reach for the red button? Clearly, Washington thinks that they will not. They are trying to call Moscow's bluff here, having mulled this decision for months. But what is clear, I think, is that the war has clearly entered a very critical new phase with this development.
OK, Ivor, for now in Moscow, thank you for that. Well, today, the Ministry of Defence announced it's expanding military support for Ukraine with a further £7.5 million for attack and surveillance drones. The government also said spending on support for Ukraine is now at its highest level, with £3 billion this year and every year for as long as it takes. And the Defence Secretary, John Healey, confirmed the number of Ukrainian recruits being trained who had been trained in the UK has now passed 50,000. All right, let's go to Rio and bring in our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who's at the G20. Deb, great to have you with us. Look, we heard from Ivor there and from Sergei Lavrov as well, saying that this war is now in a new phase. Just how dangerous a time is this?
Well, it's a time when Western capitals will be holding their breath. Their officials have long advised against listening to Vladimir Putin's sabre rattling, saying that Moscow knows that it doesn't want a direct war with NATO because that would be a war where it would lose. NATO by far outmatches Moscow when it comes to sheer firepower. And remember, Moscow has been fighting this war in Ukraine now, the full-scale invasion, for the last 1,000 days, which has significantly impacted its own military strength. But Vladimir Putin has really set his stall very clearly when it came to the use specifically of these longer-range ballistic missiles when it comes to the US. And for the UK, we're talking about Storm Shadow cruise missiles. We don't know yet whether the UK has allowed Ukraine to use those weapons too. But the Russian president has said that if Western allies allow Ukraine to use these specific weapons, then it would fuel the fire of the conflict. It would potentially trigger a global war. So he clearly cannot do nothing. Western allies would say, though, to that this is not about the West escalating the war. This is about Western allies supporting Ukraine in responding to Moscow's escalations. Over the last few weeks, we've had reports about North Korean troops joining the war on the Russian side, thousands of North Korean soldiers on the ground. There's also Iranian ballistic missiles, reportedly, according to the US and the UK, now being inside Russia to be used against Ukraine. For the West, they clearly felt they couldn't allow Ukraine to keep having to absorb these escalations on the Russian side. They've calculated that they could give these weapons to Ukraine, or the permissions to use these weapons inside Russia. The thing that makes it different to, for example, tanks or artillery, which the US and the UK already allow Ukraine to fire into Russian territory, is, as Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was implying there, because these longer-range missiles, they do require Western input. They require US data. There's also been suggestions about, the sort of involvement that's needed on the Western side to ensure that these weapons are as potent as possible. And I think that is the red line that President Putin has drawn and warned the West not to cross. They've now crossed it. And so what happens next really is a wait and see. I can't imagine it's going to be as devastating as nuclear war. That's clearly more of the Russian nuclear brinksmanship. but Russia is going to have to respond in some way.
OK, Deb, for now, thank you for that. That's Deborah Haynes there in Rio. Let's bring in our security and defence analyst, Professor Michael Clark. Professor Clark, before we get into the attack, just on that final point about the targeting systems that Deborah was making there, this part of the Russian sort of argument. I mean, how much are NATO troops, US troops, Western troops involved in the targeting?
Oh, they do. I mean, Western intelligence is, it's not required, but it's very helpful because it can be very precise. I mean, Western intelligence assets can place Russian forces, I mean, Russian ammunition stores, even if they're moving around, or ammunition vehicles or convoys and so on. And the Ukrainians can't really do that for themselves, so they can get intelligence from us. And then some of the weapons that the Ukrainians do use Western technology. So undoubtedly, we've never made any bones about that.
It's been there since the war began.
Since the war began, that's right, yeah.
OK, let's talk about these attackers then specifically. The reports that 6 have been fired at Bryansk. How much will they change the course of the war? Yeah,
Karachev, they were, according to the Ukrainians, they were targeted at Karachev against the 1046 Logistics Support Unit, which almost certainly is ammunition. And that's about 200 kilometres away from Kursk, 120-odd miles, well within the range of the ATACMS. Quite likely that 6 were fired. I find it very hard to believe that the Russians would have brought 5 of them down. They might have brought 1 of them down. But I don't know of any defensive systems that can really deal with 6 ATACMS inbound. These are ballistic missiles. It's like trying to get an artillery shell while it drops on you from a great height. It's very, very difficult. I find that very hard to believe. But we'll see. I mean, more evidence will come out. So undoubtedly, this is the sort of thing the Ukrainians want to do, to go deeper inside Russia. Not really deep inside, but deeper inside to affect the logistics, the supplies, particularly the ammunition that's being brought forward into the Kursk region. So the Ukrainians will argue, look, this is all about Kursk. We're not trying to widen the wall. We're trying to defend our troops in Kursk. We're holding on to Kursk for a bit longer, for as long as possible, certainly until next year.
I mean, 6 shoots. Do you know how many they were given of these attacks?
We don't know. That's classified. But they will have been given something in the hundreds. Right. I mean, these can be fired from multiple launch rocket systems. You remember the HIMARS, the HIMAR systems? Well, these go from the same vehicles. It's just a better piece of ammunition that goes onto the system.
Excellent. OK. The UK use of cruise missiles, the Storm Shadow that the Ukrainians have got, are we expecting that there will be a licence given for them to be used to strike into Russia?
You would think so, because it's now... I mean, everything else has been given. If ATACMS are now available to be used, at least in this theatre, then why not Storm Shadow, Scalp, which is the French version? So I suspect that will resolve itself. I'm still bemused, actually, as to all the different reasons our government gives for saying we can't give this permission, even though we want to, because the rationale seem to shift between 2 or 3 different reasons. I mean, that's up to them, but I suspect that they will disappear reasonably soon, because at least between now and the 20th of January, when President Trump takes over, there is a willingness on the part of the Biden administration and the main Western allies to do all we can to help Ukraine improve its position before things really start to change, as they are expected to do, not inevitable, but expected to do.